Hello everyone. Hope all of you are doing well, and I hope all of you have attempted Rodha True CLAT 1 mock. How was it? I hope you would have found it very similar to actual CLAT that we saw last year, and what we have been seeing for past 6 years since the change of the pattern. So let's quickly move to the solutions for this mock, right? I hope आपको mock देने में मजा आया होगा काफी, right? But the best part is कि ठीक है, if you have made any mistakes, if you have made any errors, and if you are thinking how you could have solved any particular question in a lesser time, so let's see that together कि हम कैसे इस मॉक को सॉल्व कर सकते थे, what would have been the right answer, and कोई wrong answers भी थे तो उनको हम कैसे eliminate easily कर सकते थे. Okay, so let's go order wise in the order of the section from question number 1 to question number 120, right? Of course you can choose any order that you want while attempting the mock, but for the sake of these solutions, for the sake of discussing these solutions, let's start from question number 1 from the section English language. All right, so this was our first passage, and I think we can clearly see that this is an is a letter written to Adolf Hitler, right, by none other than father of our nation, Mohandas Karamchand Gandhi, right? Now let's quickly have a look through the letter. He has mentioned his address. Then he writes, friends have been urging me to write to you for the sake of humanity. We have to see the date here, 1939, which was closer to the World War II. Thus, I think uh, Gandhiji wrote this letter to Adolf Hitler, who was the then Chancellor of Germany. Now, now he writes, but I have resisted their because of the feeling that any letter from me would be an impertinence. Because उस टाइम पर Hitler was also in a very commanding position in Germany, and he had a very big role also to play in World War II, right? Thus, Mr. M. K. Gandhi here is saying कि अगर मैं आपको कोई लेटर लिखूंगा, right, which a lot of people have requested me to write, right, that would be a bit of disrespect from my end. That is what he felt, right? Then he writes, something tells me that I must not calculate and that I must make my appeal for whatever it may be worth. It is quite clear that you are today the one person in the world who can prevent a war, which was World War II, which may reduce humanity to the savage state. Must you pay that price for an object, however worthy it may appear to you to be? Will you listen to the appeal of one who has deliberately shunned the method of war, not without considerable success? So here Gandhiji is giving the example of how he used to get out of war through his non-violence. Okay? He never resorted to violence. He always tried to use non-violent methods to resist against anything or during the freedom struggle of India, right? And lastly, he writes, anyway, I anticipate your forgiveness if I have erred in writing to you. Again, since यहाँ पे we saw that he was very skeptical about it, that he might disrespect, and just to clarify, he already asked his forgiveness. Okay, let's quickly look at the questions. So question number 1 is asking, according to the author, which is who? Mr. Mohandas Karamchand Gandhi, what is the fundamental aspect of his appeal to Hitler? Right? जो अपील उन्होंने इस लेटर के थ्रू की टू हिटलर, व्हाट वाज द फंडामेंटल एस्पेक्ट? ठीक है, let's quickly look at the options. Option A says it arises from political compulsion rather than personal conviction. We can clearly see from the letter that there was no political compulsion involved in it, right? Because India was also not directly part of that war. He rather Gandhiji, Mr. M.K. Gandhi, the author here, was just requesting Hitler. Okay, so there was no political compulsion. Thus, this option is not correct. Okay. Now let's look at option number B. It is driven by a spontaneous moral impulse. Yes, we can see the moral impulse in the letter rather than calculated diplomacy. In fact, if we see the passage here, the author writes that something tells me that he was having that feeling that he must not calculate, right? And thus he wrote that letter. So yes, here it was not driven by calculated diplomacy. It can be a correct answer. But let's quickly look at the other options as well. Option C says it reflects an attempt to reconcile conflicting national interests, right? But if we see this letter, nowhere it is mentioned that it is conflicting with national interest. ठीक है, नेशनल इंटरेस्ट की इनफैक्ट कहीं पर भी बात ही नहीं हुई है in this entire passage. Thus, this option is also wrong. Fourth option says it is motivated by the hope of gaining strategic advantage for India, which is nowhere mentioned in the passage, right? Thus, this option is also wrong. So, the correct option is option number B. Moving to next question. Question says what can be inferred from the author's tone throughout the passage, right? Let's look at the options. Option A says he is submissive yet morally assertive. Yes, I think we can say because when we see that when he writes, the author writes that he had the feeling that any letter from him would be an impertinence, right? And at the end also we saw that the author anticipated forgiveness from Adolf Hitler, right? Thus we can see, yeah, he was a bit submissive and also morally assertive due to the fact that the author mentioned that and in fact requested that Hitler is the one person in the world who can prevent a war and he should not pay the price of humanity being reduced to a savage state. ठीक है, कितना भी वर्दी हिटलर को लग रहा हो but he must not pay the price that this war can actually reduce the humanity to a savage state है ना. Thus he was morally assertive. Yes, this can be a possible answer. Let's look at the other options. He is skeptical and condescending. But what we can see from the passage, he was not skeptical at all, right? In fact, the author was very assertive about it that the Hitler should actually give a thought to preventing this war, right? In fact, we see there was no condescending here means somehow means superiority. But nowhere in the passage we can see that the author wanted to be superior, right? In fact, again, as we saw, he asked for the forgiveness and he was also not sure while writing the letter. Thus, this is the wrong answer. The option C says he is indifferent and emotionally detached, which is completely wrong. Why? Because he was very emotionally attached while writing those lines. And option D says accusatory and confrontational, which is also wrong because he was not accusing, rather, the author was requesting. Thus, the correct answer is option number A. Moving to question number 3. Which of the following statements best encapsulates the main idea of the passage? ठीक है, तो यहाँ पे क्वेश्चन हमसे मेन आइडिया के बारे में पूछ रहा है. Let's quickly look at the options. Option A says the author criticizes Hitler's military ambitions and threatens retaliation. यहाँ पे the option is saying that he was criticizing Hitler's military ambitions, which is not true. Why? Because we can directly see from the passage that Gandhiji did not threaten or did not criticize in the entire letter. Rather, he was very peaceful about it and very requestive about it. This option is also wrong. Now, option B says the author seeks to persuade Hitler. Yes, we could see that to prevent a destructive war. This is also we saw in the passage through a moral appeal. Yes, he was making a moral appeal. So, this can be the right answer. Let's quickly look at the other options. The author offers political advice to strengthen diplomatic relations between Germany and India. This is nowhere talked about in the passage, thus, an incorrect answer. And option D says the author justifies his own country's stance on neutrality during global conflict, which is also incorrect. Why? Because there is nowhere the author has mentioned about the India's stance or his country's stance. Okay, thus the correct answer is option number B. Moving to question number 4, what was the utility of forgiveness to the author in this letter? Right? यहाँ पे we can see the author was asking for the forgiveness to Hitler, right? And in fact, the tone from the beginning has been like that when he was very skeptical about it by writing to it, feeling that it would be disrespect to Hitler. Okay, so let's quickly look at the option. It served as a rhetorical safeguard against offending Hitler. Okay, yes, he was unsure whether or not he'll offend Hitler. So yes, this can be a correct option. Let's quickly look at the other options. It reflected Gandhi's lack of confidence in his moral stance, which is completely wrong because he was very confident. Like when talking about confidence in his moral stance, he was very confident about his moral stance. Rather, he was a bit skeptical that requesting such thing to a leader like Hitler, who was very prominent, who was very important to the World War II, right? Thus, the confidence was not about his moral stance, but he was a bit skeptical about offending Hitler, right? Thus, this is the wrong option. Option C says it was a political maneuver to gain sympathy, which is completely wrong because nowhere passage talks about the same, right? And option says it was intended to make his message appear trivial and harmless. Definitely not correct. Why? Because the message was not at all trivial and harmless. Rather, it was very, very important to prevent the war. Right? Thus, the correct answer is option number A. Moving to question number 5. What is the meaning of word impertinence as used in the passage? As we also discussed this, है ना हमने डिस्कस किया था पैसेज पढ़ते इट वाज though the letter was a respectful inquiry or request, but this word doesn't mean that. Okay, thus it is wrong. It was actually meaning that Gandhiji was unsure or skeptical that it might disrespect Hitler. Thus, impertinence in the passage was used directly to infer disrespect. Thus, this is the correct answer. There was no diplomatic expression of concern in the passage. Gandhiji was not diplomatic at all. Rather, he was requesting to make sure that the war doesn't happen. And it was also not a cautious suggestion. Moving to question number 6. Based on the author's appeal, what can be inferred about his worldview? Okay, now the question is asking, basis whatever author has written to Hitler, what can we actually infer? है ना? It's an inference based question. In general, what could be the world view of the author? ठीक है? Let's quickly look at the options. Option number A says he believes moral persuasion can triumph even against political aggression. That is true. Yes, the author Mohandas Karamchand Gandhi was trying to persuade Hitler through his moral stance and he actually believed है ना क्योंकि अगर उनको believe ही नहीं होता कि that moral persuasion can actually prevent that war ठीक है तब तो there was no point in writing that letter ठीक है thus he believed that it can actually triumph even against political aggression that was being shown at the time of the war ठीक है this can be a correct option. Let's look at the other options. He trusts that humanity's progress depends solely on military strength, which is completely wrong because it is clearly mentioned that they wanted, and he wrote in this line also that he was trying to appeal to Hitler that he himself has actually shunned the method of war or not resorted to the method of war. Okay, during also freedom struggle, है ना? And of course, he also got considerable success in that. Okay, thus it is very clear that he believed or he thought that it doesn't depend solely on military strength. Now, option number C says he views war as victory means. That this is also wrong, as we discussed in the last options. And again, option D says he assumes that violence is an inevitable outcome. That is also untrue because he always tried to be non-violent. And in fact, what we can see from the passage also from this line that He was saying that he was referring to himself, who actually deliberately shunned that method of war and resorted to non-violence and actually got considerable success also. है ना? In the same. Thus, this is also wrong. Thus, the correct answer is option number A. All right, quickly moving to passage number 2. Let's quickly read it. Let your thoughts go back along the years to the first years you can remember anything about to the times of which your father and mother or perhaps your grandfather and grandmother have told you. ठीक है? The author is asking to think of earliest of the times which is possible. Farther than that. ठीक है? Go back in the pages of history. Even farther than the history of the years when our savior was on earth. That is a long time to think back, is it not? But our record tells us that Caesar was born 100 years before Christ. Okay, 100 BC. He must have been a diligent student, for he became learned in philosophy and science and thoroughly understood all the arts of war. Now we can see the passage starts with actually discussing about thinking about history, right? Long back in history. And from that, he jumped to the story of Caesar. ठीक है? यहाँ पे it says those of you who have progressed so far in your Latin studies are familiar with his history of the wars. What author is referring to? Author is referring to the Caesar's lifetime here. है ना? And Caesar's history of the wars he waged with the Helvetii, a nation which occupied what is now Switzerland and with a king called Ariovistus. This was a German king who crossed over the line of into Gaul. And if you have read the story of these wars, the wars in and around the time of Caesar, right? You know something of his peculiarity as a historian, as well as something of his skill in carrying on war. Okay, what author is referring to? The author is referring to Caesar's skill here. For 7 years, he waged war in Gaul. In the meantime, invading Britain. After this, the Senate at Rome commanded Caesar to disband his army and return to Rome. Then this he refused to do except under certain conditions. What were those conditions? Of course, these conditions were refused, and the Senate further declared that unless his army was disbanded by a certain day, Caesar would be considered a public enemy. So what he's saying, the Senate actually asked Caesar कि आप अपनी आर्मी डिस्बैंड करके रिटर्न टू रोम बट सीजर रिफ्यूज एंड thus the senate declared अगर by a certain day if you don't disband it you would consider the a public enemy of Rome. When he heard of this decree he called his soldiers together and by his eloquence made them feel that both he who Caesar and they which are his soldiers had been treated badly. ठीक है? He made them understand that they were treated badly and then he determined to go on, right, in the war. ठीक है? It was not lawful for a general to lead an army into the province of Rome unless upon occasions of coming in great triumph, which he had not found by that time. Okay, let's quickly look at the options. Option question number 7 asks, according to the passage, what was remarkable about Caesar's early life? ठीक है? Early life के बारे में we read somewhere here. ठीक है? That he was a learned in philosophy and science and understood the arts of war. Was he uninterested? No, he was not. Rather, he was a very diligent student. Option B says he became a great scientist. Passage nowhere talks about science, so this is also wrong. He studied philosophy and science diligently. This is very clear and can be seen from the passage that he was he became learned in philosophy and he was a diligent student. Okay. The passage though says that he became learned in science doesn't mean it he actually became a scientist, right? Thus option B was wrong. Option C seems correct. He was a famous artist. Nowhere passage talks about he being famous as an artist. So this is also wrong. Moving to question number 8. What did the Senate command Caesar to do after his war in Gaul? We clearly saw the Senate did not ask the Caesar to invade Britain again, right? Senate did not ask him to continue conquering Gaul, right? And also did not ask to write his history. Rather, the Senate actually asked Caesar to disband his army and return to Rome. Okay, so B is the correct answer. Question number 9 asks us what was the Senate's reaction when Caesar refused to obey their command. Let's quickly look at the passage. The conditions were refused, right? And Caesar refused to disband the army. Then what Senate did? Senate declared that unless his army was disbanded by a certain day, he would be considered a public enemy. Let's quickly look at the option. कौन सा option बोल रहा है? Option we can clearly see. Option C says they declared him a public enemy. Option A says rewarded him from bravery, which is wrong. They did not even send reinforcements, and they also did not ignore that. Rather, they declared him public enemy. Question number 10. What effect did Caesar's speech have on his soldiers? Caesar's की जो speech थी, which we talked about in the last paragraph, made made the soldiers feel that both Caesar and the soldiers had been treated badly and they should go on, right? Of course, it did not made him lose faith in him. It convinced that they are wrong. No, that is also wrong. It made them feel that they had been treated badly, which is directly written in the passage. So this must be the correct answer. It caused them to leave his army. Also, they also did not leave his army. So correct answer is option number C. Question 11 asks us what made Caesar famous as both a general and a historian. Okay, let's quickly look at the options. His skill in carrying on war, yes, he was very skillful in carrying on war and recording it. Recording of there is it isn't mentioned though anywhere, but yes, since he was waging war in Gaul and he decided to continue also, this can be a correct answer. Let's quickly look at option number B. His successor teacher of philosophy. Nowhere the passage mentioned at all that he was a teacher of philosophy, though we saw that he studied philosophy, but nowhere it mentions that he taught also. This is wrong. His inventions in science, again, we saw that he studied science also, but the passage doesn't talk about any of the invention. Thus, this is also wrong. His work as a Roman senator also is something that is not at all being talked about in the passage. Thus, this is also wrong. Thus, the correct answer is option number A, his skill in carrying on war and recording it. ठीक है? In fact, if we'll see the passage where you where it says if you have read the story of these wars, right? The wars into the Gaul by Caesar, you know something of his peculiarity as a historian. So thus it clearly mentions that he used to record all these wars as well. Okay. The last question for this passage asks us, according to the passage, what law did Caesar break? Option A says leading an army into the province of Rome without permission. Okay, option B says refusing to teach philosophy. This is definitely wrong. Nowhere it talks disobeying orders during battle. Okay, the orders were not disobeyed during battle. Rather, the disobedience, है ना, were to return to Rome. ठीक है, thus this is also the wrong answer. है ना, the orders that were given by the Senate nowhere talked about battle and what should be the behavior during the battle. ठीक है, writing about his was this was not a law or something that Caesar broke. So thus the correct answer should be he led an army into the province without the permission of the Senate. Thus this is correct. ठीक है, let's move to the next passage. In the first place, it can be important to look at the way men identify themselves in the society. Okay, they're talking about men and how they identify themselves in the society. Okay, interestingly, there are certain stereotypes concerning men in this respect. For instance, क्या stereotypes हैं? Men often try to hold leading positions and they try to fit the image of a tough guy who can reach his aims and who can reach the top. Therefore, men often try to measure their masculinity, which is often referred to as men's feeling है ना, or other males masculinity with the help of this category. What category? That who can reach the aims and who can reach the top. The higher post a man holds, the more man like he seems. It is also important to note that many often think that men have no right to be sentimental when reaching their aims. However, ठीक है, this passage talked about कि man actually see themselves, ठीक है, on the parameter of masculinity. जितना कोई guy या man tough होगा, जितनी जल्दी he can reach his aims or reach to the top, ठीक है, the more masculine he would be, ठीक है. But in the last sentence the author clarifies that these are only stereotypes, ठीक है. Now ठीक है, nowadays men are not expected to be sharks in the human society, right? Though masculinity is still associated with high social position, but at the same time they're not expected to make their way over corpses, ठीक है. What the author is trying to say through this line is even though masculinity is prevalent in current times also and it is actually associated with high social position, but just because of that masculinity, just because to reach the top and the aims, okay, they would not make way over their corpses, which means they would not do anything just to reach their aims and reach to the top. Now, such feature as responsibility is more important. Okay, so the author has provided emphasis on something called responsibility as a feature in mankind. Okay, men are regarded as human beings now who are responsible when it comes to making decisions. ठीक है, being a man presupposes, ठीक है, means if you are a man nowadays, it assumes that being responsible for various projects and for various people as well involved in the same, right? Now, so this has become most important measurement for males. What? The responsibility, right? It is also important to state that masculinity has always been associated with competitiveness. ठीक है, we saw in the first paragraph when we talked about that who can reach his aims and who can reach the top, talked about competitiveness also, है ना. In fact, in the second paragraph, it referred to masculinity, right? With higher post a man holds, the more man-like he seems, and there is a certain competitiveness in that. Thus, men have always tried to prove that they are tough. ठीक है, in the previous times also, in current times also. But now this competitiveness, though it also remains nowadays, but it is now also associated with responsibility. ठीक है, which is now a very important measurement for males. Men do not simply try to win the race, okay, now, but they are supposed to be responsible, and men cannot lose self-control to do anything. Thus, masculinity nowadays, ठीक है, in the current times presupposes, ठीक है, it takes that as a fact that masculinity or men have to be responsible, है ना, and competitive and self-control should be there while ensuring the responsibility. Let's quickly look at the questions. Question number 13 says, according to the author, what is the fundamental aspect of masculinity in contemporary society? ठीक है, in the current society, what is the fundamental aspect? We clearly saw that responsibility is the fundamental aspect. ठीक है, and it is the most important thing nowadays, and also balancing it with competitiveness. Quickly looking at the other options. Holding the highest possible social position, this is wrong because this is not at all the fundamental thing nowadays. ठीक है, they nowadays do not simply try to win the race. ठीक है, option B says exhibiting emotional restraint and toughness, that this is also wrong. Option D says dominating others to reach one's goal, this is also wrong because now it is important that this responsibility comes with self-control and competitiveness. ठीक है, question 14 asks, what can be inferred from the author's opinion about traditional masculine stereotypes? ठीक है, something we talked about in first two paragraphs of this passage. They are outdated and oversimplify men's social roles. They accurately reflect men's natural tendencies. They continue to define male identity fully in modern times. They are necessary to maintain competitiveness among men. ठीक है, फर्स्ट ऑप्शन बोल रहा है कि ऑफ कोर्स ट्रेडिशनल जो स्टीरियोटाइप्स होते थे ना वो we saw in the further paragraphs कि they are not applicable anymore to their fullest extent, है ना? And so definitely they are outdated, ठीक है? And they actually used to oversimplify men's social roles. They have to be superior, ठीक है? They have to be that tough guy who can reach their aims and who can lead or hold leading positions, right? So of course author of was of an opinion कि ट्रेडिशनल जो मैस्कुलिन स्टेरियोटाइप था which is now outdated and used to oversimplify men social roles. Looking at option number B, they accurately reflect men's natural tendencies, which is definitely wrong because it used to be in the traditional society, but this is not at all continued in the modern society. ठीक है? In the contemporary societies, the men's natural tendencies have shifted from being that leader or having that leading position to more of responsibilities, right? They continue to define male identity fully in modern times. This is also wrong. Okay, because the male identity has again shifted to responsibility with competitiveness nowadays, and they are necessary to maintain competitiveness. This is also very wrong, right? Because in the contemporary society, what is more important? Responsibility is more important. Thus, the correct answer is option number A. Moving to question number 15. What is the meaning of the word presupposes as used in the passage? As we saw, it actually meant to assume something as a necessary condition. है ना? As a fact that is taken कि ये तो है ही, इसके बाद something happens. ठीक है? To suggest something entirely, this is wrong. To contradict an existing belief, this is also wrong. And to deny the importance of something, this is also wrong. है ना? We could clearly read out that it means to assume something as a necessary condition. Question number 16 asks us which statement best encapsulates the main idea. Okay, now this is a main idea question. What we saw in first two paragraphs, it talked about masculinity in the traditional society, जहाँ पे they did not have right to be sentimental. ठीक है, they often try to hold leading positions and they try to use that image of a tough guy, है ना, who can reach always reach his aims and reach the top. ठीक है, however in the subsequent paragraph we saw that in the modern society, in the contemporary society, the focus has shifted to the responsibility, ठीक है, among all the men. So option A says modern masculinity emphasizes dominance. This is wrong. Why? Because this is not modern, but the traditional society used to have this trait among the men. Masculinity is no longer linked with professional ambition. This is also wrong because we saw at the last कि professional ambition is always there, okay, but and competitiveness is also there, but this is now associated with responsibility. Okay, this is also wrong. Now option C says masculinity today is characterized by responsibility, which is true, and self-control and competitiveness along with that self-control. So this must be true. Option D says man should abandon competitiveness to become more empathetic. This is also wrong because we need to have all three things: responsibility, competitiveness, and self-control. Chalo, moving to question number 17. Which of the following is an accurate elaboration of this sentence? What sentence is? Men are regarded as human beings who are responsible when it comes to making decisions. Okay? So, of course, this is something that was talked about in the first two paragraphs. Okay? Now, let's look at the options. Society now defines masculinity through one's willingness to act aggressively. ठीक है, this is definitely wrong क्योंकि in the current time nowadays this does not holds true because अब aggressiveness से ज़्यादा important है responsibility. ठीक है, again and again we are talking about responsibility in the current tense. Men are expected to manage people and projects with accountability. दिस कैन बी ट्रू, ठीक है। मैन आर एडमायर्ड ओनली फॉर इमोशनल सेंसिटिविटी, दैट इज रॉन्ग, बिकॉज यहाँ पे बहुत सुपरलेटिव हो गया कि ओनली एडमायर्ड फॉर इमोशनल सेंसिटिविटी, विच इज रॉन्ग, ठीक है। देयर आर अदर थिंग्स ऑल्सो फॉर विच मैन आर एडमायर्ड, बिकॉज दे आर रिस्पॉन्सिबल पीपल, दे आर सपोज टू बी रिस्पॉन्सिबल ना, अलॉन्ग विद the self-control and competitiveness, ठीक है। Responsibility is now seen as unrelated to masculinity. This is also wrong. Why? Because passage clearly mentions that responsibility is also very very important along with competitiveness and self-control. Thus the correct answer seems to be option number B, ठीक है। चलो, moving on to question number 18. What can be inferred about author's view on competitiveness in modern masculinity, ठीक है। Again, we saw competitiveness is important in modern masculinity also, so it should not be replaced. Option A is wrong. It is irrelevant. Okay, this is also wrong because it is also relevant. Option C says it is valuable when guided by responsibility and self-control, the three pillars that we saw for modern masculinity. This must be true. It should be intensified. Passage nowhere talks about intensifying competitiveness to prove masculinity. So this is wrong. So the correct answer is option number C. Moving to question number passage number four, sorry. It reads, when I started law school, okay, so author is actually telling his own account, okay, that when the author started law school, I loved it. The author loved it. The hyper competitive classroom, the demanding coursework, and the adrenaline rush of solving complex cases drove me to pursue this career. Which career? Since the author has entered law school, so definitely the career in law. Once I officially earned the job title lawyer, ठीक है, after he completed law school, है ना, he earned the job title lawyer, I was drawn even more to the fast paced work culture. I wanted to stand out there, है ना, because law school में भी the classroom were hyper competitive, the course was demanding, है ना, and he used to that get that adrenaline rush, है ना, while solving complex cases, है ना, and that is the reason, है ना, what it drove the author to pursue the career in law, ठीक है। So definitely he wanted to stand out, है ना, make a difference and find his own niche. He says, my work was my passion and it powered me. What I didn't realize was the same work was also steering me onto the path of debilitating burnout, ठीक है। So he was very passionate, right, he wanted to make a difference, है ना, he also liked the work, but at the same time that work, है ना, that pressure of work actually was leading the author into the burnout. One afternoon in the summer of 2020, I was sitting in my office when a feeling of intense fear gripped me. I slipped into a loop of troubling thoughts about my life. Why? Because of that burnout happening due to the work pressure. About my life, my love, and my job. The more I tried to escape it, the deeper I dove. I was scared, very, very scared. My heartbeat quickened, and aftershocks of the feeling shadowed me for days. Each time I entered my office, a familiar dread followed. Okay, because the work pressure was so much. है ना? My concentration dwindled, I lost my focus, and I turned to alcohol for refuge. It took me several months to finally admit to myself and to my loved ones that I needed help. ठीक है? Initially, what happened? When he joined, he loved the work, he was passionate about it, wanted to find his own niche, but he later on realized that it was leading him into burnout. He was very stressed and he got into fear also, right? It continued for long, right? But it actually took him months to admit to himself and to realize that he actually needed help. Later, I learned from a professional that I had severe anxiety and was put on medication because of that. My recovery has been a humbling experience. ठीक है? Of course, he realized, ठीक है, he resorted to a medical means, he turned to a professional, talked to a professional, and he got to know that he has severe anxiety. And of course, it can be he or she, author can be anything, or the author was put on medication for his or her anxiety. है ना? The recovery was an humbling experience. Why? Because it has put the author into put many things into perspective for the author. Okay, let's quickly look at the options. According to the author, what was the fundamental aspect of their initial experience in law school? ठीक है, initial experience में क्या था, बहुत competitive environment था, right? We saw the coursework was demanding and there were complex cases which used to give the author adrenaline rush. ठीक है? So, of course, what we can see, the supportive and collaborative nature, this might not be true because the nature was or the environment was very competitive, as we can see, right? So it was not at all supportive and collaborative. So this might not be true. The thrill of intellectual challenge and competition. This may actually be true because there was competition that was being talked about, है ना? And when it says that the solving those complex cases used to give him adrenaline rush, and the classrooms are also hyper competitive, है ना? So of course there was a thrill, the struggle to maintain a work-life balance. Of course, in the initial experience, there's nowhere work-life balance is being talked about. This is completely wrong. The emotional burden of constant self-doubt, which did not happen during law school. Thus, it is also wrong. Thus, the correct answer is option number B. Next question says, what can be inferred from the author's account of their professional life before burnout? ठीक है? So before burnout, he was very happy, he was very ambitious, right? He was very passionate about the work, and it also empowered the author. ठीक है? Let's see which option talks about it. They prioritize personal relationship over career advancement. This is wrong because he wanted to make a career, he wanted to stand out. Their passion for work blinded them to the signs of emotional exhaustion, which we saw later on. He was very exhausted. Okay, he had a burnout because of the work. Yes, and he was also passionate for the work that actually blinded the author, which led to this emotional exhaustion. This can be a true option. They were dissatisfied with their career choice from the beginning. No, definitely not, because he was very passionate about the career from the beginning. The author actually was very passionate, है ना? And the adrenaline rush that the author used to get in the law school, ठीक है? That is why he was very passionate about pursuing this career. So this is wrong. The colleague discouraged them from working too hard. Of course, there was competitiveness, but there was nowhere it was said that the author was discouraged. Thus, the correct answer is option number B. Next question asks, what is the meaning of the phrase steering me onto the path of deliberating burnout? ये कैसे हुआ था? Burnout. He got burned out and later on found out that he had severe anxiety because of the work. है ना? So let's see what it means. Guiding the author towards professional recognition. This is wrong because he actually got into anxiety. Forcing the author to change the career path deliberately. Author did not change their career path. ठीक है, कहीं भी passage में it is not mentioned. This is also wrong. Leading the author unknowingly towards mental and physical exhaustion. Of course, yes, this is being talked about in the passage that unknowingly he led, or this work led the author to this exhaustion. This can be correct. Last option says motivating the author to achieve more success. Yes, it did motivate it, but as this line says, this actually led the author onto a path or towards physical exhaustion. So this is also wrong. Correct answer is option C. Now moving to question number 22, it asks about the main idea of the passage. What it says, कि पहले he was in law school, very passionate about work, but it actually led to mental distress. He got anxious. He had to resort to a professional, है ना? And that recovery phase was also a humbling experience for the author. ठीक है? Option A says passion for work can sometimes conceal the onset of mental distress. This can be correct, right? We saw this in the passage. Let's mark it for now. Option B says competitive environments are essential for personal growth, though they are important, but we can say they are essential for personal growth, right? Because it actually led the author into exhaustion. Thus, this is wrong. Medication is the only effective way. Passage nowhere talks about that it is the only effective way. Thus, it is also wrong. This is one of the means, or seeking the help of a professional is one of the means that the author resorted to. Thus, it is not important to have medication all the time. Career success always lead to personal fulfillment. This is also wrong because what it led to for the author is the mental exhaustion and anxiety. Thus, the correct answer is option A. Now, question 23 asks, which of the following is an accurate elaboration of this sentence? My recovery has been a humbling experience, right? Humbling experience means it must have been a good and positive experience for the author, right? Thus, let's read out the options. The author's recovery process diminished their confidence permanently, which is completely wrong. Rather, this actually made him more confident. Okay, it actually put many things into perspective for the author. So definitely, it was not bad at all. Rather, it was a good experience. So this must be wrong. The author recognized their limitations and gained deeper self-awareness. This might be true, as we could see from the last line. The author lost interest in their profession after recovering. ये कहीं पे बात नहीं है passage में. Thus, this must be wrong. And option D says the author's recovery made them resent the legal profession. इसके बारे में भी कहीं भी बात नहीं हुई in the passage. In the last line also, this is also wrong. Thus, the correct answer is option B. Last question for English. What can be inferred about the author's attitude toward their past ambitions? ठीक है, जो ambitions थे before starting the work in the initial days of work, ठीक है, उसके बारे में author का attitude, what is the possibility and what can we infer from the same? Author now view them as excessive and unsustainable. Yes, this might be true. Why? Because it led the author into anxiety. They regret ever entering the law school. This is wrong because the author did not regret. Okay. In fact, he loved the competitive environment. They believe ambition and success are incompatible. This is also very wrong because, of course, that work, particular work, है ना, led to this anxiety. But this doesn't mean at all that ambition and success are incompatible to each other. ठीक है, because in order to get success, you have to be ambitious. ठीक है, this is also wrong. They think burnout is unavoidable in high pressure jobs. ठीक है, because author is nowhere saying कि जो भी high pressure job होती है वहां पे it's unavoidable. He said it happened to it, it happened with the author, but doesn't mean कि it's 100% true that it will be there for almost all the jobs. ठीक है, so this is also false. So the correct answer is option A, that the author now views them as excessive. ठीक है, not unavoidable. So let's quickly look at our second section, that is current affairs including general knowledge. The first passage here says, on the night of May 6-7, 2025, India launched a targeted operation against terrorist infrastructure at 9 locations in Pakistan and Pakistan occupied Kashmir, that is POK. ठीक है, definitely what we can see, the operation that is being talked about here is Operation Sindoor, which happened in May. है ना, the military action the government said was a direct response to the terror attack that left 26 people dead, most of them Indian tourists, right? Which terror attack is being talked about here? It is the Pahalgam terror attack, which happened on 22nd of April in 2025 itself. ठीक है, what happened after that attack? As a retaliation measure, India actually uh, suspended the Indus Water Treaty and also closed the Atari border. ठीक है, as soon as that attack happened in Pahalgam on 22nd, India suspended the Indus Water Treaty as retaliation and also closed the Atari border. Right? उसके बाद क्या हुआ? The Prime Minister, the government gave the green signal to the army take or gave that operational freedom to the army to take any measure or to respond to the attack that was done in Pahalgam, because it was thought that that is directly linked. The attack which happened in Pahalgam was directly linked to Pakistan and the terrorists from Pakistan. The government said it struck the headquarters belonging to Lashkar-e-Taiba and Jaish-e-Mohammed. So what India did, they launched targeted Operation Sindoor on the night of May 6-7 in the early hours of May 7, है ना? And they actually targeted the headquarters belonging to these two terrorist organizations. ठीक है? One of the sites that was targeted was Bahawalpur, which was home to Jaish and its leader Masood Azhar, and another site was Murid which was linked to Lashkar at Taiba and its founder, Hafiz Saeed. Okay? These were the cities which were targeted. These groups have been tied to some of the deadliest terror attacks in India, including 2008 Mumbai attacks and the recent massacre in Pahalgam. Okay? Because the confidential information, okay, the research, the information that India received, right, led India to believe that these two terrorist organizations are tied to the attacks at Pahalgam and also the attack in Mumbai in 2008. है ना? Unlike previous Indian military operations, often given conventional or mythological names to convey strength or maintain secrecy, the name here given was Operation Sindoor, which actually carried a very emotional resonance. Why? Because a lot of families were targeted in that attack, and a lot of families lost their loved ones in this attack. It reflects a deliberate effort to blend military action with a tribute to civilian loss and national grief for that civilian loss. ठीक है? Looking at the questions, what was the imminent trigger cited by India for launching this operation? Definitely, it was the April 22 terror attack in Pahalgam. ठीक है? Which of the following cities was not among the four in Pakistan or POK that India said is stuck in Operation Sindhu? Definitely Bahawalpur and Murid के are the ones जिनका तो पैसेज में mentioned है. Karachi being a port city in Pakistan, ठीक है, वहां पे पोर्ट है, and there was no information about any terrorism movement or terrorist movement in Karachi. Thus, the third city that was targeted was Sialkot in the northern part of Pakistan. Thus, Karachi was not among the cities targeted by India during Operation Sindoor. Which militant organizations was explicitly named by Indian government were Jaish-e-Mohammed and Lashkar-e-Taiba, as mentioned in the passage. Which of these statements about Operation Sindoor is correct? Indian strikes deliberately targeted Pakistani military bases. This is completely wrong because military bases were not targeted. In fact, this was very clearly clarified by the government that these strikes were very focused, measured, and non-escalatory in nature, which means the India, the Indian government was not trying to target Pakistani military bases or any Pakistani government institution. Rather, they were only targeting the bases of terrorists. ठीक है? No ceasefire was agreed, conflict continued, but yes, the ceasefire was agreed upon by Indian government and Pakistani government, right? The DGMOs, the Director Generals, the DGMOs, which is the Director Generals of Military Operations of both India and Pakistan, agreed to actually agreed for a ceasefire on May 10 after a lot of requests from Pakistan also. ठीक है, because in fact the actions did not stop just after Indian strikes. Pakistan also retaliated with a lot of strikes, right? A lot of Pakistan also retaliated with a lot of drone strikes, right? Now the strikes option C says the strikes were described by India as measured and non-escalatory. This is very true because Indian government clarified that the strikes were focused, measured, and non-escalatory in nature. The operation involved only ground assaults by special forces. This is also wrong because there were air strikes involved. Okay, the correct answer is option C. On what date did India and Pakistan agree to cease hostilities following the conflict triggered the Operation Sindhu? We saw that it started on April 20, 22nd April 2025 with Pahalgam attack. Then India had Operation Sindoor starting from 6th, 7th May. Then it continued for 2 more days, and on 10th of May, finally agreed for a ceasefire. So the correct answer is option C, May 10. The naming of the operation is Sindoor hold symbolic resonance. Which of these interpretations best matches what has been reported about its naming? ठीक है, definitely we saw in the passage itself that it reflected a deliberate effort to blend military action with a tribute to civilian loss and a national grief, right? Thus, let's see if any option talks about it. It doesn't refer to any major river. This is wrong. It actually emphasizes cultural and emotional symbolism connected to civilian loss. This is correct. Not an acronym for a security agency, and it was also not chosen randomly. Okay. Thus, the correct answer is option B. Quickly looking at next passage, which talks about Amit Shah, the Home Minister, has recently introduced in a brazen manner 130th Constitutional Amendment Bill, which aims to disqualify elected ministers, including even the Prime Ministers, for the only reason that they were detained in custody beyond 30 days. Okay. Now, the important thing to note here is that they were detained in custody and that should be beyond 30 days. ठीक है, the home minister has gone around town parroting the question, what is wrong in a universal morality being enshrined in a legislation? ठीक है, universal morality is कि अगर सब लोगों को whoever is detained, whoever is convicted also, right, whoever is accused, ठीक है, in general public at large what we see, if someone is accused, ठीक है, they are deprived of a lot of their rights and responsibilities. However, at the same time, why doesn't it apply to the ministers and the elected ministers, and why doesn't it apply to prime minister as well? That if the ministers or prime ministers are detained beyond 30 days, then there's some reasonable ground for them to discontinue with their post, right? And he also posed that chief secretaries and the director general of police must also not take orders from the central prison, where the arrested chief minister who has failed to come out on bail within 30 days is sheltered, right? When the minister or chief minister or elected ministers, they themselves are in a prison, right? Then the other authorities like chief secretaries and DGPs should not take orders from them. Okay. Now the question asks this bill. Okay. Of course, this is only a bill introduced by the home minister in the house in the parliament. This proposes to amend which sets of provisions. Okay. Now quickly looking at the options, you know, Article 368 definitely talks about the constitutional amendments. Okay, so definitely this bill has nothing to do with constitutional amendments. Thus, this option is wrong for sure. Okay. Article 74, 163, and 239A, right? They basically talk about advice by Council of Ministers. Now, Article 74 talks about aids and advice by the union, the union government, ठीक है, or the Council of Ministers in union government. While Article 163 talks about aid and advice to the governor of a state and aid and advice by the Council of Ministers. And actually, Article 239A also talks about the rights or aids and advice rights by the ministers for the NCT of Delhi. ठीक है. Article 75, 164 and 239 actually talk about these things wherein the new clauses have been put to amend the provisions with respect to what happens to their post when they're detained in custody beyond 30 days. So this is the correct answer. This is wrong. Article 72, 161 and 239B are also not, like, do not talk about this thing. They actually talk about pardons by president and the governor respectively. ठीक है. So the correct answer is option B. Question 32 says, under the bill, what exactly triggers removal from office? We clearly saw that in the passage that there should be a detainment in custody beyond 30 days. है ना? That should trigger removal from office. ठीक है. Now option A says any arrest regardless of the offense. This is wrong. Conviction with at least 6 month sentence. ये भी wrong है. Not given. 15 days continuous detentions. The passage talks about 30 days. ठीक है. This is also wrong. Now option D says 30 consecutive days custody for an offense punishable with imprisonment of 5 years of most, which is the correct answer. ठीक है. The correct answer is option number D. Next question says, under the current law, because this amendment has not taken place, this is only a bill. ठीक है. Before this, under the current law, when does a sitting MP MLA get disqualified from the house? When a charge sheet is filed. This is wrong because charge sheet can be filed anytime. This doesn't disqualify them from the house from that moment itself. On arrest in a corruption case, corruption has nothing to do about it. It has to do with any criminal offense punishable with imprisonment also for 5 years or more. Okay. On conviction, typically in a sentence with 2 years or more, leading to immediate disqualification. Yes, current law says about conviction that not only they should be detained. Okay. The current law not only talks about detainment, but it is important to have conviction. है ना? The court must convict the MP or MLA for them to get disqualified from the house. ठीक है. Mere accusation and a detainment post it doesn't disqualify them from the house. ठीक है. When charges are framed for private trial court, this is also wrong. Question 34 says, what happened procedurally to the 130th amendment bill after introduction by Home Minister in Lok Sabha or in the Parliament? It was referred to, yes, this is the correct answer. The bill was actually referred to the Joint Parliamentary Committee, which was a joint committee wherein the leaders from almost all the parties are there from both the houses to discuss the provisions of the bill that is being introduced. Okay? It was not sent to Rajya Sabha Select Committee. It was not examined by the Standing Committee on Home Affairs, even though the bill was presented by the Home Minister, but it had nothing to do with Standing Committee on Home Affairs. And it was not at all passed because this is still a bill under consideration by the Joint Parliamentary Committee. Okay? This is also wrong. Correct answer is option A. What is the bill prescribed specifically for the Prime Minister if the 30-day कस्टडी कंडीशन इज मेट, विच मीन्स कि अगर 30 डेज की जो कंडीशन इस बिल में है अगर वो मीट हो जाती है तो व्हाट इज प्रिस्क्राइब टू द प्राइम मिनिस्टर. द प्रेसिडेंट में एट डिस्क्रिप्शन, ऑफ कोर्स प्रेसिडेंट एट डिस्क्रिप्शन कैन नॉट डिसमिस द पीएम. दिस इज रॉन्ग. लोकसभा नो कॉन्फ्रेंस वोट इज मैंडेटरी. दिस इज नॉट बीन टॉक्ड अबाउट एट ऑल इन द बिल. पीएम मस्ट टेंडर रेजिग्नेशन बाय 31st डे बिकॉज 38 डे की विंडो हो गई है. पीएम इज नॉट एबल टू गेट बेल फॉर द ऑफेंस, है ना. दस the PM has to tender resignation, failing which अगर PM cannot or PM does not resign by 31st day, PM ceases to hold the office thereafter. Thus, this is the correct answer. The PM continues in office unless convicted by the court. This is as per current law, but as per the bill, it prescribes that the Prime Minister ceases to hold office after 30 days. Moving to next passage, talks about ISRO chairman V. Narayana today said that India's maiden manned space mission Gaganyaan will conduct its first test flight in December this year. Addressing a press conference in New Delhi, Professor Narayanan said that Gaganyaan is progressing well as 80% tests or around 7,700 tests have been conducted so far. The number of tests which have been decided to be conducted were roughly around 10,000. ठीक है, जो टेस्ट जो डिसाइडेड थे टू बी कंडक्टेड वर रफली 10,000, है ना, एंड ऑलमोस्ट 80% विच इज 7,700 टेस्ट हैव बीन कंडक्टेड ऑलरेडी. ठीक है, अबाउट द गगनयान. He added that remaining 2,300, again we can directly see 7,700 were done, 2,300 were remaining, so it was somewhere around 10,000 will be completed by March next year. Highlighting other achievements of ISRO, he said that 196 accomplishments have been achieved so far this year by ISRO, including this GLEX and a high thrust electric propulsion system developed by ISRO. He noted that 6,500 kilogram satellite of US will also be launched from Indian launch pad. What used to happen till now कि इंडिया की भी काफी सारी सैटेलाइट्स ऐसी होती थी which we used to launch from USA and of course from launch pads in India also. But this would be the first time when a US satellite will also be launched from Indian launch pad. He further highlighted that 13 terabits of data from Aditya Lunar 1 L1 has been provided to the scientific community throughout this year. He provided all these achievements. And talking about ISRO's role in Axiom 4 mission, the chairman V. Narayanan mentioned that ISRO's technical expertise played a crucial role in ensuring that the mission is safely launched. है ना? He noted that what did that also that what ISRO did was to correct the LOX leakage observed in the first stage of the Falcon 9 rocket. ठीक है, जो रॉकेट जब लॉन्च होता है देयर आर मल्टीपल स्टेजेस इन्वॉल्व. इसके फर्स्ट स्टेज में देयर वाज अ लीकेज जिसको इसरो ने करेक्ट किया एंड help key in correcting that, avoiding a catastrophic failure. Looking at the questions, ISRO has indicated that first uncrewed mission is planned for which month and year? This is December 2025, as directly mentioned in the passage. According to the latest briefing, roughly how many tests are planned? We saw that is 10,000. What will fly aboard the first uncrewed Gaganyaan mission as a passenger crew systems in proxy? Okay, this is a very interesting question. Why? Because of course the Gaganyaan mission, right, has been uncrewed till now. ठीक है, गगनयान मिशन में अभी तक नहीं जाते थे, but this time they decided that as a proxy to a passenger or a crew, they would send something, and for that, what they did, they actually built, है ना, a AI based humanoid robot which was named Vyomitra. ठीक है, so the reason was how it is different from other three. This CubeSat was very different, which was actually prepared by the scientists from IIT Bombay, right? It was actually a satellite, okay, which was launched long ago in 2016. Okay, so this has nothing to do with Gaganyaan. Okay, the payload of lunar regolith simulant is also not right because this cannot serve as a proxy to a crew. ठीक है, प्रज्ञान rover engineering model also this is a machine, this is a rover, ठीक है, which is a 6-wheeler vehicle kind of a thing, है ना, which was used in the lunar missions when India had Chandrayaan 2 and 3. ठीक है, so this was also not used. Correct answer is humanoid robot व्योममित्र. ठीक है, जो एक्चुअली में इन द मिशन इन द फ्लाइट इन द स्पेस क्राफ्ट जहां पे पैसेंजर पे क्रू बैठा होता है, राइट? वहां पर दैट ह्यूमनॉइड विल सिट, ठीक है, एंड इसरो विल टॉक टू दैट robot, to that humanoid in or inside that spacecraft from here, and also that humanoid will monitor the life support and all the cabin parameters. Actually, when a spacecraft is launched, na, the crew inside that, they are in continuous communication with the scientists at earth, on earth, right? अर्थ पे जैसे इसरो अगर कोई लॉन्च कर रहा है, तो दे आर इन डायरेक्ट कॉन्टेक्ट विद द क्रू, बट रादर क्रू की जगह दैट thing, है ना, that purpose will be solved by the humanoid robot. So correct answer is A. Next question asks, after a liquid oxygen leak was detected on Falcon 9 for Axiom 4, which description best captures the ISRO's role? ISRO actually helped in repairing the same. ठीक है, took over the countdown as lead launch authority. This is wrong. Recommended repairs, replacement and a low temperature leak test while SpaceX performed the fixes and launch was rescheduled. This can be right. ISRO declined to participate in the review, which is wrong. ISRO team personally repaired. This is also wrong because ISRO actually helped in repairing the same, है ना? And they recommended the repairs and replacement, which the SpaceX scientists performed. ठीक है, तो correct answer is C. ISRO has announced plans to launch from India US built satellites weighing approximately 6,500 kg, which is directly mentioned in the passage. ISRO's first official release from Aditya L1 Solar Observatory was made on, the correct answer is January 6, 2025. All these dates are not relevant with Aditya L1 Solar Observatory. ठीक है. Now, next passage says about the first official visit of British PM Keir Starmer on October 8-9 at the invitation of PM Narendra Modi. The PM, Indian PM, or the visit by the British PM reciprocated the visit by Indian PM Modi in July 2025, okay, to London, which is in Britain, which saw the signing of landmark Comprehensive Economic and Trade Agreement, which is called a CETA. Starmer's visit marks an optimistic uptick in India-UK economic cooperation at a time when global geopolitics and trade faced unprecedented disruptions and uncertainty due to wars such as Russia, Ukraine, Iran, Israel, Israel, Hamas, and so on. Okay, we can see a lot of wars or geopolitical tensions happening between a lot of countries. Thus, the trade is being disrupted because of these wars, right? From unilateral sanctions and punitive tariffs to intersecting alliances and multi alignments necessitated by continuously evolving security concerns, every factor of our interconnected world seems to be forced towards a reboot. As the Ukraine war ravages the financial planning of governments across Europe, the UK too has felt a significant impact. Higher energy costs have affected daily life and industrial productivity. Why? Because a lot of energy has been procured from Ukraine by the European countries. ठीक है, high expenditure on support for Ukraine. Again, at the same time, the European countries are also spending on support for Ukraine. ठीक है, UK has committed up to 20.8 billion euros, has necessitated a recasting of its domestic expenditure outlay, even as it copes with the fallout of Brexit and COVID. Looking at the questions, Keir Starmer, ठीक है, who is the Prime Minister of Britain, first visit to India followed which major event earlier this year, which is July में PM Modi's visit to London for signing of this CETA agreement. During Starmer's visit, the Indian UK leaders plan to review progress along a roadmap named. So this during their visit, they actually planned and they actually decided to have a roadmap, ठीक है, going ahead to decide what has to be done in the upcoming years by both the countries with respect to their trade and other policies. They named it Vision 2035, looking at the 10-year plan between both the countries. ठीक, which I was calling is not part of the agenda of India UK visit as per official release. As per official release, they had to review trade, investment, and climate cooperation. They had Just a moment. Yes, this is correct. Also holding a global fintech festival and keynote exchange. This is also true. But there was no mention in the agenda about negotiation on a visa-free regime between UK and India. Thus, this is not the part. Thus, this is the right answer. Of course, the agenda included discussing defense, security, technology, education, and people-to-people ties as well. Next question asked, the passage mentions that the UK has committed up to 21.8 billion euros in support for Ukraine. Which of the statement is correct in light of the recent facts? Okay. That amounts refers solely to military aid. This is wrong because it was not solely for military aid. It includes cumulative UK assistance packages including loans, guarantees, and humanitarian reconstruction support. This is true. UK has retracted that pledge, capping support at 10 billion now. This is also wrong because this the pledge or the support has not been kept. This is 21.8 billion euros only. That figure is meant only for reconstruction in Ukraine, not defense or humanitarian aid. This is also wrong because this is also made for humanitarian and reconstruction support. The coalition of willing mentioned the related diplomacy around Ukraine refers to what it may refer to. यूक्रेन की बात हो रही है, ठीक है, कोalition of the willing, what willing for to help यूक्रेन, ठीक है, and the coalition formed by those countries, ठीक है. So option A says UK led group of countries ready to commit troops of guarantees in the Ukraine post for peacekeeping. This is true because this is the coalition formed by these group of countries who are willing to help Ukraine post war. NATO subsuming agreement for joint European defense. This is wrong. New G20 trade is also not right here about Ukraine, and UN resolution for measures against Russia. This is also not right. So this is the coalition by the group of countries led by UK who are willing or ready to commit troops and help Ukraine post-war. Okay. Now moving to next passage talks about Mahatma Gandhi, whom Netaji Bose rightly called as father of the nation, was undoubtedly the prime mover of India's struggle for freedom. Okay. He was father of Indian nationalism and foster mother of new awakening that swept across the length and breadth of the country. How? Cutting across all sections of people. How? Through his non-violent means. ठीक है, and non-violent movements. He was the greatest mass leader of India, and no other leader could equal him in the stature. Thus, that is the reason he was called father of the nation, and that is why his face, his picture is on the Indian currency note as well. He was that important in Indian history. Moreover, it was under his leadership and vision that the whole of India plunged into the cauldron of the freedom struggle. Okay, the freedom struggle starts somewhere around 1857, but his role, okay, right from 1900s was very, very important. In their own ways, under the umbrella of his leadership and strategy, many other great leaders such as Pandit Nehru, Sardar Patel, and Rajendra Prasad also made memorable contributions to the struggle for India's freedom. Outside the Gandhian mainstream, there were also revolutionary fighters. ठीक है, यहाँ पे गांधीयन मेन स्ट्रीम से बात हो रही है. द लीडर्स हु रिसॉर्ट टू नॉन वायलेंस, ठीक है, दे डिड नॉट रिसॉर्टेड टू वायलेंट मीन्स, ठीक है, इन इंडियाज फ्रीडम स्ट्रगल, बट देवर other revolutionary fighters like Netaji Subhash Chandra Bose, who created Indian National Army, Shahid Bhagat Singh, Chandra Shekhar Azad, whose contributions were no less significant. And their suffering and sacrifice for the cause of India's freedom should, of course, be recognized and given its place in the pension of history. Okay? So, not only Gandhi's or Mahatma Gandhi's measures were important, but also the contributions of revolutionary fighters like Netaji Subhash Chandra Bose, Bhagat Singh, and Chandrasekhar Azad are also important. Question asked, which of the following movements mark Mahatma Gandhi's first active participation in India's national freedom struggle after his return from South Africa? So he actually returned from South Africa around 1916-1917, where he was studying. He was studying law. ठीक है, उसके बाद he came back to India, and right after coming back, he started Champaran Satyagrah in the state of Bihar in 1917. ठीक है, against, what was it against? It was against the ऑप्रेसिव पॉलिसीज, ठीक है, जो ब्रिटिश गवर्नमेंट की पॉलिसीज थी फॉर इंडिगो प्लांटेशन, उसके अगेंस्ट ही स्टार्टेड चंपारण सत्याग्रह, which is the correct answer. Let's quickly look at the other options. This civil disobedience movement started in 1930, ठीक है, जहाँ पे सॉल्ट लॉ आया था एंड देयर वाज दांडी मार्च, राइट. नॉन कॉपरेशन मूवमेंट, when we talk about it, this was actually in 1920 against that रूल एक्ट है ना, जिसकी वजह से जलियांवाला बाग भी हुआ था. जलियांवाला बाग मैसेकर हुआ, ठीक है. देयर वाज रूल एक्ट दैट केम इनटू पिक्चर. दिस हैपेंड इन 1919. पोस्ट दैट द नॉन कोऑपरेशन मूवमेंट वाज लॉन्च्ड एंड द खिलाफत मूवमेंट वाज from 1919 to 1922. This was by Indian Muslims who were fighting against British India also, and fighting against the dismemberment of Ottoman Empire. So this had nothing to do with Indian freedom struggle. Rather, it has something to do with the geopolitics or things going on in the Middle East, in the Ottoman Empire, in the current, in and around the current state of Turkey. ठीक है, चलो नेक्स्ट क्वेश्चन. ड्यूरिंग द सिविल डिसोबीडियंस मूवमेंट विच ऑफ द फॉलोइंग, अच्छा वी टॉक्ड अबाउट सिविल डिसोबीडियंस मूवमेंट विच स्टार्टेड इन 1930, राइट. This which of the leaders following leaders was not part of the Gandhi Irwin Pact negotiations. Of course, Mahatma Gandhi and Lord Irwin were part of that. ठीक है. Sardar Vallabhbhai Patel also assisted in the same, and Pandit Jawaharlal Nehru was not the part of these negotiations which took place between Gandhi and Irwin. ठीक है. Thus, the correct answer is Jawaharlal Nehru. ठीक है. Which of the following correctly describes the ideological difference between Mahatma Gandhi and Subhash Chandra Bose? ठीक है. Of course, we saw Subhash Chandra Bose as a revolutionary leader, while Mahatma Gandhi usually resorted to non-violence, right? Thus, option A is believed in violent struggle. This is wrong. He emphasized on moral reform. He emphasized on arms resistance. This can be true. Both promoted complete non-cooperation through armed revolt. This is also wrong because Mahatma Gandhi resorted to non-violent means, है ना. And Gandhi was opposed to self-rule for India. This is also wrong because अगर यही सेल्फ रूल के अपोज होते तो entire freedom struggle wouldn't have taken place. ठीक है, and he wouldn't have played a major role in the freedom struggle. ठीक है. Which of the following is correctly matched with this, with its year? Quit India movement was not done in 1932. It was happened in 1942. Dandi March, as we discussed in the earlier question, was started in 1930. Jallianwala Bagh massacre happened in 1990. Formation of Indian National Congress was in 1885 by Sir A.O. Hume. ठीक है, जो ब्रिटिश सिविल सर्विसेज के एक ऑफिसर थे. And when this was established in 1985, the first president of INC was WC Banerjee. ठीक है. Sardar Vallabhbhai Patel earned the title Iron Man of India primarily for his role in which of the following? ठीक है. When India was divided in 1947, ठीक है, when we talk about India was divided, so division was Pakistan and India. ठीक है. एंड जो अनडिवाइडेड इंडिया था उससे पहले, ठीक है, तो देवर लॉट ऑफ स्टेट्स देयर बोथ इन, मतलब इन द अनडिवाइडेड इंडिया. ठीक है. अब जब दोनों का बंटवारा हुआ, राइट, जब पार्टीशन हुआ, एट द टाइम ऑफ पार्टीशन, अब इट वाज इंपॉर्टेंट टू डिसाइड कि कौन सा स्टेट विल गो टू पाकिस्तान, कौन सा स्टेट विल गो टू इंडिया, एंड ऑल द स्टेट्स हैव देयर ओन प्रायोरिटीज. ठीक है, ओन इंटरेस्ट्स, है ना, बिकॉज प्रायर टू दैट देयर वर प्रिंसली स्टेट्स कंट्रोल्ड initially by the princes. ठीक है, later on company, the British East India Company took over a lot of control over all those. ठीक है, but the princely rule continued to exist. ठीक है, till 1947 है ना. So what Vallabh Bhai Patel did, he actually helped in integration of those princely states, because there was a lot of retaliation, or a lot of confusion from the states of Hyderabad, Nizams of Hyderabad, from the state of Jammu Kashmir, right? Thus, he played a very, very important role in the integration of those states, and thus earned the title of Iron Man of India. Correct answer is thus option number B, 51. Next question asked, which revolutionary organization was associated with Bhagat Singh, Rajguru, and Sukhdev, who were put to death, है ना, उनको फांसी दे दी गई थी, but they were part of the organization called the Hindustan Socialist Republican Association. ठीक है, तो correct answer is C. All right, so let's quickly start with section number 3, that is legal reasoning. So let's quickly read out the first passage. ठीक है, थोड़ा comparatively बड़ा passage है, but let's see what is being talked about in the passage. It says the Work Amendment Act 2025 represents a major reconfiguration of the Work Act 1995, aimed at introducing transparency. ठीक है, so there was this earlier Act 1995 का Work Act. Now an Amendment Act is being brought to amend this act, है ना, which aims to introduce transparency, inclusivity, accountability in the administration of work properties. It re-christians the original statute as a unified, अगेन इस एक्ट को अमेंड करके उस एक्ट का नाम भी क्या बोल रहे हैं, यूनिफाइड वर्क मैनेजमेंट एम्पावरमेंट एफिशिएंसी एंड डेवलपमेंट एक्ट ऑफ 1995, रिफ्लेक्टिंग इट्स ब्रॉडर एडमिनिस्ट्रेटिव एंड डेवलपमेंटल ऑब्जेक्टिव्स. ठीक है, as we saw that they aim to introduce transparency, inclusivity and accountability. ठीक है, the amendments restructure the composition of both state work boards as well as the central work council by mandating representation from different Muslim sects such as Sunni, Shia, Bohra, and Aga Khani, as well as from socially and educationally backward classes. The inclusion of up to four non-Muslim professionals with administrative or legal expertise and at least two Muslim women is designed to promote professional and gender diversity within the work management framework. The Act empowers the central government to make rules for registration, accounting, and auditing, and digitization of work records, marking a shift from state-centric governance, which was there in the Act, earlier Act of 1995, right, to a more centralized supervisory. है ना? So this is being shifted from state governments or state-centric governments to more of a centralized governments. The jurisdiction of work tribunals has been expanded to cover all civil matters concerning work properties, with the right of appeal to the High Court. Again, this right has been given under the new Act to High Court within 90 days. The abolition of the doctrine of work by user, which had permitted earlier informal dedication through long-term religious use, signifies a move towards formal registration and documentary proof of ownership. ठीक है, which this change which has been brought in the new act. Equally significant is the prohibition against unilateral declaration of government or private land as work property, which used to be there earlier in that, but without demonstrable title, this won't be there in the as per the new act. The application of limitation law to work claims and the removal of section 107 of the 1995 act, which had exempted work from limitation, introduce a stricter procedural regime. ठीक है, इस section में भी there was a change. ठीक है, जो section used to talk about exemption of work from limitation, ठीक है, this has been changed, which in order to introduce a stricter procedural regime with respect to this law related to work boards. ठीक है, now district collectors are also authorized to determine ownership disputes in specific cases, thereby expanding administrative oversight. ठीक है, we saw firstly earlier it was only state centric governance, but it was shifted to more of a centralized supervisory model, as well as uh, the administrative oversight has also been increased by authorizing district collectors to authorize the ownership disputes also in certain cases. From a constitutional standpoint, the amendments engage the delicate balance between state regulation and religious autonomy under Article 25-26, which talk about religious freedom, and Article 14, right to equality of the Constitution. The inclusion of non-Muslims and government officials in Waqf bodies may invite scrutiny on grounds of excessive state interference in the religious affairs, right? Because this law is related to mostly to Muslims only, right? And the new law, the new act is mandating for non-Muslim professionals as well as to Muslim women also. Okay? This might actually invite any scrutiny on grounds that state or the country this by making this act is trying to interfere in the religious affairs, which is protected by Article 25 and 26 of the Indian Constitution. So now a case is mentioned, which is Board of Works from West Bengal versus Anis Fatma Begum. That is a 2010 case. The Supreme Court held that Waqf is a public trust subject to state regulation. Okay, but emphasize that there's a need to preserve essential religious characteristics, which again are protected by Articles 25 and 26. Similarly, in the case of Karnataka Board of Works versus Government of India 2004 case, the court recognized the legitimacy of state oversight while insisting on reference to a religious identity of work institutions. Again, in both the cases, what we can see that, of course, public the Supreme Court in both the cases has said that this public trust put on the work votes, okay, is subject to state regulations, but at the same time insisted that there's a need to preserve the essential religious characteristics as well as deference on deference to the religious identity of work institutions. Okay, the 2025 amendments through this act, right, by expanding executive control and redefining the concept of Waqf property, are thus poised to test the constitutional limits of the state intervention. Okay, as we discussed, that Article 25-26 talks about the rights है ना, to religion, okay, and managing the individual's religious freedom, right? So, of course, bringing these kind of concepts in the Amendment Act can actually test the constitutional limits whether or not they are constitutionally valid. ठीक है, चलो let's quickly look at the questions. The 2025 amendment renames the principal act because we saw that. What is the most plausible, ठीक है, most reasonable legislative intention behind this renaming? ठीक है, पहले simple name क्या था? वक्फ अमेंडमेंट, सॉरी वक्फ एक्ट, ठीक है, सिंपली टॉक्ड अबाउट कि वक्फ से रिलेटेड एक्ट है, ठीक है. अब द नेम हैज बीन चेंज टू यूनिफाइड वक्फ मैनेजमेंट एम्पावरमेंट एफिशिएंसी एंड डेवलपमेंट एक्ट. ठीक है, देयर इज अ रीजन व्हाई दीस वर्ड्स हैव बीन एडेड. So let's quickly look at the options. To limit the jurisdiction of work boats to religious matters only, because the term unified implies restriction of, no, this is not correct, because we can see there have been mention of words like management, empowerment, efficiency, development. Also, to broaden the objectives of the act to include administrative and developmental functions, because the new title emphasizes efficiency and development, this can be true. Too much work votes of different states into one central board body, because the word unified indicates organizational consolidation. This is wrong because it does not merge different states into one bodies. Rather, it what it does is it actually shifts the focus from state center governance to more of centralized supervision. Okay, not completely merging the different states into one central body. Option D says to delegate all work matters exclusively to the central government. Again, this is wrong because इनका रोल बढ़ा दिया गया है, but it is not completely shifting the responsibility or matters to the central government. ठीक है, so the correct answer is option B. Looking at question number 54, suppose the Sunni Waqf Board of a state refuses to appoint any Shia non-Muslim members, arguing that Waqf administration is a matter of religious autonomy protected under Article 26 of the Constitution. Based on the passage, which interpretation best aligns with the 2025 amendment? 2025 amendment mandates any Waqf board to have members from all communities, right? As we can see here, it mandates representation from different Muslim sects. ठीक है, thus if it only talk about the interpretation basis the 2025 amendment without looking at the constitutional validity which is not being talked about at all in the passage. ठीक है, तो ideally ये जो refusal है that won't stand. ठीक है, so here the board position cannot be valid, this cannot be right. ठीक है, again क्योंकि valid वो नहीं है, तो दैट मीन्स दिस कैन ऑल्सो नॉट बी करेक्ट. ठीक है, क्योंकि ये दोनों ऑप्शन बात करते हैं बोर्ड की पोजीशन की वैलिडिटी की कि दे आर वैलिड. ठीक है, लुकिंग एट अब अगेन लास्ट ऑप्शन also says that it is partially valid because inclusion of women is mandatory, but this is optional, which is wrong because this is also mandatory as we saw directly in the passage. Thus, the correct answer is option B, which says it is invalid because the amendment mandates representation from different sects and non-Muslims to ensure inclusivity and professional diversity. ठीक है, चलो moving to next question. The abolition of the doctrine of work by user primarily signifies which of the following shifts in legal approach. ठीक है, so basically that there used to be doctrine of work by user which has now been abolished by Act of 2025. ठीक है, now let's see the options from formal registration to informal recognition of work through religious use. This is wrong because now we are shifting towards formal registration, right? So this is wrong. From community based recognition to statutory and documentary proof of ownership, yes, that can be true because as we can see in the renaming also and also in the amendments to the provisions, okay, it reflects broader administrative and developmental objectives through all the changes and all the amendments in the act. Okay, which actually empowers the central government also to for registration, accounting, auditing, and digitization of records. Okay, thus we can see, of course, the focus is to shift this recognition of work boards to a statutory and documentary proof of ownership. Okay, this can be the correct answer. From central control to state level decision making, this is actually vice versa. So this is also wrong. From administrative oversight to judicial self-regulation of by work tribunals. This is also wrong because again this is also vice versa, that the focus or the shift is from self-regulation by work tribunals to administrative oversight by state central government as well as the district collector as we saw in certain matters. Okay. Moving to question number 56. So it says if a private individual claims that his ancestral land has become Waqf property because it has been used for prayers for 80 years, what results follow under amended act? ठीक है, amended act में हमने देखा registration has become mandatory. Let's see which option fits. The claim would succeed because long-term religious uses creates Waqf by user which is now been abolished. ठीक है, so this is wrong. Moving to option B, the claim would fail because the amendment requires demonstrable title and prohibits unilateral declaration. This is correct as per the passage. Claim would succeed if supported by testimony. No, claim would not succeed at all in any case. ठीक है, even if the local religious committee gives the testimony. ठीक है, this is wrong because this is nowhere talked about in the passage also. Claim would fail because limitation law now bars all Waqf related claims after 60 years. But if we see the passage, it is not being talked about at all in the passage about the limitation law and this barring all the claims after 60 years. This is also wrong. The correct answer is option B. Next question says the passage denotes that district collectors are now empowered to determine ownership disputes involving work property. Which of the following best represents the constitutional issue that could arise? ठीक है, we talked about in the passage while reading the passage कि क्योंकि बहुत ज़्यादा government supervision has been introduced by state government, by central government as well as by district collectors. ठीक है, and we discussed that this may result in arising of constitutional issue which has been protected under Article 25 and 26. Okay, the rights which are given under Article 25-26 of the Indian Constitution, issues can arise against that. Okay, so let's quickly see. Option A says may violate the right of equality under Article 14 by excluding judicial scrutiny, but nowhere it is being talked about that judicial scrutiny is being excluded. Rather, it is being talked about that the decision rests with the work board, but there's also you also get to appeal or right to appeal to the High Court within 90 days. ठीक है? So judicial scrutiny तो नहीं हटाई गई है, thus this is wrong. It may raise concerns under Article 25-26 due to possible state interference in the administration. This can be right. We saw it in the passage. It may contravene the right to property by removing ownership from private citizens. This is wrong because this is also not nowhere talked about in the passage. It may violate the independence of works tribunals under the High Court's appellate authority. Again, High Court having the appellate authority do not or does not at all violate the independence of work tribunals. Okay, thus this is also wrong. Correct answer is option B. Moving to question number 58, based on the Supreme Court decisions mentioned, we talked about two Supreme Court decisions. What constitutional principle do the 2025 amendments most likely test? Whether work institutions can claim absolute immunity from state control? This is wrong. Why? Because absolute immunity by work institutions has been rejected. ठीक है, they cannot claim absolute immunity. ठीक है, thus this is wrong. Whether state can abolish all work boards or assume direct control of religious endowments, this is also wrong because they have the supervisory power. ठीक है, they can supervise, they can frame rules and regulations, but they cannot assume direct control. ठीक है, of all the matters related to work boards. Whether expanded executive supervision can coexist with the preservation of essential religious identity. That is what was talked about in the both the cases, right? That of course this religious identity as guaranteed under Article 25 and 26 of the Indian Constitution has to be there alongside the executive supervision for the better control and better management, है ना, and better development of the act as well as the provisions under the same. ठीक है, so this must be the correct answer. Option D says whether inclusion of backward classes violate the secular structure of the constitution. This has not been talked about in the passage, thus this is wrong. Okay, moving to next passage. It is, I think, fairly smaller than the last one. Section 84 of the Bharatiya Nyaya Sanhita, which is the newer law replacing Indian Penal Code, retains the traditional framework of the insanity defense. ठीक है, again traditional framework as per the earlier law. ठीक है, about the defense of insanity, which was grounded in Manhattan principles. It states that nothing is an offense. ठीक है, यहाँ पे एक लॉ की बात हो रही है. ठीक है, what the law states, nothing is an offense if at the time of the act the accused by reason of unsoundness of mind was incapable of knowing the nature of the act. ठीक है, or incapable of knowing that it was either wrong or contrary to the law. ठीक है, but this provision under the law, ठीक है, under section 84 of Bharatiya Nyaya Sanhita, this draws a clear distinction between medical insanity and legal insanity. ठीक है, of course these are two different principles. Medical insanity में जब एक proper medicine, proper medical authority, right, decides and says that a person is insane, ठीक है, versus when the court decides, है ना, and declares a person to be insane. Restriction restricting the defense to situation where the mental incapacity is so severe. ठीक है, ये डिफेंस क्योंकि बहुत क्लियर डिस्टिंक्शन बना दिया, ठीक है, कि इट शुड नॉट बी एप्लीकेबल इन ऑल केसेस ऑफ इंसैनिटी. ठीक है, दस शुड बी एप्लीकेबल इन केसेस ऑफ मेडिकल इंसैनिटी ओनली, है ना, विच रिस्ट्रिक्टेड द डिफेंस टू सिचुएशन जहां पे मेंटल इनकेपेसिटी जो है, जो इंसैनिटी है, सो सीवियर दैट इट एक्चुअली डिस्ट्रॉयज कॉग्निटिव और बेसिक बिहेवियरल अंडरस्टैंडिंग एट द प्रिसाइज मोमेंट ऑफ द ऑफेंस. ठीक है, this approach reinforces legal certainty and prevents the misuse of the defense. कि कोई someone can actually get a court order becoming legally insane and claiming the defense of insanity in the cases. The presumption of sanity continues to operate. ठीक है, तो basically it is always presumed that the accused is sane, है ना, and the burden to prove that he or she was insane, है ना, or she did not have the mental capacity to understand what is going on. ठीक है, so the burden lies on them, the accused, to establish that they were insane through a credible evidence. ठीक है, there has to be credible evidence, and they just have to establish the fact or a reasonable doubt about their mental condition. ठीक है, if they are able to prove, है ना, और create a reasonable doubt कि they might not be capable enough at the time of the offense to understand the nature of the act, or to understand that it is wrong or contrary to the law. Like at the same time, the prosecution, है ना, which is usually the state in the criminal cases, must still prove the essential ingredients of the crime. ठीक है, तो of course ऐसा नहीं है कि केवल incapacity पे या defense पे ही बात होगी. Of course, the prosecution also has to prove that the crime took place, and that crime has been took place or offense has been done, ठीक है, बाय द अक्यूज बियॉन्ड रीजनेबल डाउट. ठीक है, यहां पर जो बर्डन ऑफ प्रूफ होता है, ठीक है, यहाँ पे बर्डन इतना नहीं होता कि दे जस्ट पुट द डाउट दैट द अक्यूज्ड माइट हैव कमिटेड द ऑफेंस. रादर द बर्डन lies on the prosecution to prove that the essential ingredients of that crime was there beyond any reasonable doubt, है ना. The courts assess the totality of circumstances before, during, and after the act to infer the accused mental state, ensuring that claims of insanity are tested against objective indicators rather than mere assertions. ठीक है, फॉर एग्जाम्पल पॉसिबल है कि पहले पूरी प्लानिंग कर ली, ठीक है, प्लानिंग के टाइम द अक्यूज्ड वाज सेन, ठीक है, प्लान कर लिया सब कुछ, ड्यूरिंग एग्जीक्यूशन बिकॉज ऑफ सम रीजन, ठीक है, he or she becomes insane. ठीक है, बट इससे he or she won't be, the accused won't be able to claim the defense of insanity. ठीक है, क्योंकि of course जो circumstances before, during और after the act हैं, those also become very important. However, the provision has been criticized for its rigidity. It adheres strictly to cognitive incapacity, ठीक है, to not to understand कि what is going on, excluding conditions that may affect volition and emotional control without completely impairing understanding. ठीक है, there might be some situations, some conditions, some circumstances, ठीक है, जहां पे there won't be complete impairment of understanding. ठीक है, ऐसा नहीं होगा कि completely insane हो जाए, but there might be something which may affect the basic judgment of a person. ठीक है, but the provision actually exclude these kind of conditions. ठीक है, the law thus does not account for partial or diminished responsibility, leaving a gap between psychiatric reality and legal doctrine. While the approach secures societal protection from fabricated defenses, it may operate unfairly in cases where genuine mental disorders substantially affect a person's capacity for self-control or judgment, though not to the extent of total incapacity. ठीक है, when the clear distinction is made between medical insanity and legal insanity, तब वो क्या बात कर रहे हैं, that incapacity has to be that severe, है ना, that it actually destroys the cognitive understanding completely, but it does not cover when there is not a case of total incapacity, but at the time because of some reason the person is incapable of self control or judgment. ठीक है, चलो let's quickly look at the question. This Ravi, person who is suffering from a psychiatric disorder that causes him to occasionally lose control over his impulses, commits theft during an episode of what, losing control over his impulses. Medical experts confirm that while his condition impairs his self control, he could still understand that stealing is wrong. ठीक है, and what the provision under section 84 says, he must be incapable of knowing the nature of the act, that or that it was either wrong or contrary to the law, in order to claim the defense of insanity. ठीक है, वो क्लेम करने के लिए डिफेंस को, उसको कुछ भी पता नहीं होना चाहिए, बट यहाँ पे द क्वेश्चन सेज दैट द पर्सन रवि कुड अंडरस्टैंड दैट इट इज अ रॉन्ग एक्ट. ठीक है, सो अकॉर्डिंग टू द प्रिंसिपल of section 84, which is most accurate, ठीक है, cannot claim the defense, right, as we discussed, so this must be wrong. Option B also talks about claim of defense of insanity, which will fail. Option C and D says cannot claim. Let's look at the reasons. He was incapable of knowing that his act was wrong, right? Sorry, he was capable of knowing, right? Which we saw he could still understand. Okay, thus this option is correct because this disorder is a form of medical insanity. This cannot be the reason. So the correct answer is option C. Moving to question number 60, which of the following best reflects the rationale behind retaining the traditional Manhattan framework in section 84? Option C is to align legal definitions with modern psychiatric classification. This is wrong. Okay. To ensure flexibility in modern recognizing partial responsibility for offenses. Okay. Again, this is wrong. Okay. Because uh, the law actually excludes, है ना, हमने जब लॉ यहाँ पढ़ा था, it excludes the partial responsibility. ठीक है, it has to be absolute. Thus this is also wrong. To preserve legal certainty and prevent fabricated defenses, this is correct as we talked about in the passage. To prioritize emotional disturbance as a ground for exculpation, which is not at all talked about in the passage. ठीक है, because we saw that it actually what it does is it reinforces the legal certainty, है ना, in order to prevent the misuse of the defense of insanity in all the cases. ठीक है. Moving to question number 61, the accused bears the burden to establish unsoundness of mind. ठीक है, which we saw. ठीक है, he has to create a reasonable doubt. ठीक है, about the sanity, है ना, which we actually saw directly in the passage. The burden lies on the accused to establish through credible evidence a reasonable doubt as to his mental condition. Thus, it is not proof beyond reasonable doubt. Thus, is wrong. Proof that creates a reasonable doubt as to his insanity, as to his sanity. This is correct. Proof of his mental illness through medical testimony alone. This is also wrong. Proof that shifts the entire burden to the prosecution. This is also wrong. We clearly saw in the passage that it is the proof that creates a reasonable doubt as to his sanity. Next question says, suppose an accused claims insanity but acts with careful planning before the offense and tries to conceal evidence after the offense. ठीक है, based on the passage, how are courts likely to treat this claim? ठीक है, court will not treat or accept the claim. Why? Because we saw that court actually see the circumstances before, during and after that. ठीक है, to infer the mental state of the accused. ठीक है, so definitely the claim is going to be rejected. ठीक है, so this is wrong, this is wrong. Option D says defer to the accused subjective assessment of mental unsoundness. This is also not been talked about in the passage. Thus the correct option must be option B, which says reject the claim, because behavior before and after the act also indicate the awareness to the accused that the act that the accused is trying to do is wrong. ठीक है, the correct answer is option number B. चलो, moving to question number 63, which criticism of section 84 is explicitly recognized in the passage? It overemphasizes volitional incapacity because it the passage actually exclude volitional incapacity. ठीक है, they the passage did not emphasize but excluded this volitional incapacity. Thus, this is wrong. It inadequately reflects psychiatric understanding of a partial responsibility, which we saw in the last paragraph of the passage. This can be true. It allows the defense too easily in modern context, which is very wrong because there have been a lot of provisions put, which makes it a bit difficult to claim the defense of insanity. Okay? It ignores the prosecution's obligation to prove guilt, which is also wrong because this obligation is never ignored. ठीक है, it lies on the prosecution to prove beyond reasonable doubt as to the ingredients of the offense. ठीक है, so correct answer is option B. Okay, moving to next paragraph. The Delhi High Court recently had that mere courtship or consensual interaction in the pre-marriage phase does not by itself give rise to criminal liability under the false promise of or deceit provisions now embedded in section 69 of the Bharatiya Nyaya Samhita. In a bail order, Justin Arun Monga observed that if two consenting adults enters a relationship to explore the possibility of marriage, once one party's subsequent decision not to marry cannot be automatically treated as deceit. Okay? They started a relationship to explore whether or not it would be feasible, but subsequently decide not to marry, it cannot be treated as deceit. He emphasized that requiring perfect alignment of intentions during courtship, okay, during the relationship talks before marriage, would actually undercut the very purpose of the process. Okay? What is the purpose? To assess the compatibility and decide whether marriage would be viable for them or not. Okay? In the particular matter before the court, the FIR alleged that the accused had represented himself as settled abroad and committed to the complainant. Okay? Then induced intimacy on the assurance of marriage, later reneging or and demanding property in cash. Okay? The court noted material contradictions in the complainant's pleadings and WhatsApp messages, okay, including admissions that physical intimacy had not occurred. Okay? So the complainant in his or her pleadings claimed or contended that intimacy had occurred, which was not the case, found out by the court, which actually undermined the prosecutorial narrative. Prima facie, the court found that the facts did not conclusively establish that the accused never intended to marry. Okay? It could not be established conclusively beyond reasonable doubt that the accused never intended to marry from the outset, from the very beginning. Hence, the accused could not be denied bail on the ground of likely deception alone. Okay? The judgment reinforces the distinction between a breach of promise and a false promise. Okay? Promise हुआ, ठीक है, for some reason it was breached, ठीक है, versus the promise that was false from the beginning itself. ठीक है, from criminal liability under section 69, the promise must have been dishonest from the inception, from the very beginning. ठीक है, not merely that one that failed in execution at the later stage. The court suggested that allegations of dowry demands or coercion, if they exist, must be treated as distinct offences and prosecuted separately, cannot be subsumed under this false promise provision. ठीक है, in the cases of dowry and coercion, ठीक है, after marriage, this provision cannot be taken into account of false promise, है ना, deceit provision. The decisions underscores judicial caution against expansion of criminal law into consequences of private relational breakdowns, preserving personal liberty until the merits are thoroughly educated, which is being talked about also and which is being followed in the entire legal system in India. That, of course, we saw that the liability lies on the prosecution to prove beyond reasonable doubt, okay, for the offense to be there. Now, question 64 says, which of the following best captures the Delhi High Court's reasoning regarding the accused withdrawal from the proposed marriage? It amounted to deceit. ठीक है, अब दिल्ली हाई कोर्ट के जजमेंट के अकॉर्डिंग इट वाज वेरी क्लियर दैट इट डिड नॉट अमाउंट टू deceit, है ना, so this is completely wrong. It also did not amount to breach of trust because it is not been talked about in the passage regarding breach of trust, है ना, so answer must be from C or D, which talk about did not amount to deceit. Let's quickly look at the reasons. Because the decision not to marry after consensual interaction does not automatically prove this honest intent right from the beginning. ठीक है, at the beginning the intent or the intention might be honest, but later on you might decide, and that is the entire purpose of courtship as being discussed in the passage. This says because the complainant failed to produce evidence of emotional distress. इसके बारे में पैसेज में नहीं बात की गई है. Thus the correct answer is option C. ठीक है, based on the passage, when does a promise to marry amount to a false promise under section 69? ठीक है, when the promiser later refuses to marry regardless of initial intent, this is wrong. ठीक है, because इस केस में false promise नहीं होता है. The promiser makes a promise that was dishonest from the very beginning. This is the correct answer. ठीक है, as we discussed throughout the passage. Option, let's look at the other options. When the promise causes emotional or financial harm, ठीक है, this is not being talked about in the passage. And a relationship involves any form of physical intimacy, also this is not something which actually leads to false promise. ठीक है, चलो, moving to question 66. If a person falsely claims to be settled abroad, ठीक है, uses that claim to induce another into a relationship, which we talked in the passage also, which of the following would determine criminal liability under 69, section 69 as per the judgment. ठीक है, whether relationship led to marriage, this is not correct. Whether the false claim was made with the dishonest intent at the outset. ठीक है, this is again from the beginning, which is very true कि अगर शुरुआत से ही intention dishonest है, ठीक है, in that case, ठीक है, criminal liability can be determined. The correct answer is option number B. ठीक है, later on discovered the truth. This is not correct. Party exchange property or money, that is also irrelevant to the provisions of section 69. ठीक है, in the given case, court noted contradictions in the complainant's FIR and WhatsApp messages. ठीक है, कि जो complainant ने FIR की थी, ठीक है, उसमें accusation लगाया था कि they had physical intimacy and all those things, which contradicted from the WhatsApp messages. Those were produced as evidence in the court. ठीक है, so what was the legal consequence of these contradictions? ठीक है, option A says it strengthened the prosecution case, which is wrong because it actually weakened the prosecution's case. ठीक है, they were disregarded as irrelevant to the determination of intent. This is also false because it cannot be disregarded. It was clear from the WhatsApp messages and other evidence that the intention was not dishonest. Okay? And all the accusations that were made by complainant also, few of them are were false. They weaken the claim of deceit. Yes, that is true, suggesting that intimacy and inducement were not clearly established, which is important to be proved beyond reasonable doubt, right? So this might be correct. They led to an automatic acquittal of the accused. This is also not true because other evidences were also taken into account in order to decide the case. What principle did the court emphasize regarding judicial handling of relationship breakdown? यहाँ पे criminal law should be expanded to cover all failed relationships. This is not true. This is not being talked about. Courts must criminalize. It is a very harsh thing. ठीक है, that they have to or they must criminalize any emotional or financial fallout of a breakup. ठीक है, ऐसे में तो फिर सब लोग criminal बन जाएंगे, right? So this is also wrong. Criminal law should not intrude into private relational breakdowns unless deceit is clearly proven. ठीक है, because these things happen during the courtship and this is the entire purpose, of courtship or having relationship before the marriage, to understand the compatibility of or with each other. ठीक है, and in that case that criminal law should not intrude, ठीक है, until that deceit is clearly proven, ठीक है, which is proven through dishonest intention from the very beginning and any such act which leads to deceit. This can be correct. All cases involving dowry demands must be some subsumed. ठीक है, इसमें it was clearly mentioned that it must not be subsumed under false promise provision. So this is also wrong. So correct answer is option number C. Which of the following scenarios would most likely not attract criminal liability under the reasoning of this judgment? ठीक है, again the question asks likely not attract any criminal liability. A person never intended to marry but used a false promise. This will attract liability. Person demanded property after pretending commitment to marriage. ठीक है, this is also not true. ठीक है, under the reasoning of the judgment है, because this will actually attract liability, है ना, कि आप it would be dowry. ठीक है, two consenting adults explored marriage. ठीक है, but one later withdrew after realizing incompatibility, which is the essentially the purpose of finding out. Thus this particular scenario would not attract any criminal liability. Thus this is correct. A person lied about being single to induce intimacy while already married. Again, this is criminally wrong as per the provision. Thus this would attract criminal liability. Thus the correct answer is option number C. Moving to next passage, the Kerala High Court awarded rupees 3 lakh each in compensation to a wife and her children following an acid attack perpetrated by the husband. The case illustrates the court's power to direct restitutive relief under the victim compensation paradigm within the criminal justice scheme. In its decision, the court observed that heinous act of throwing acid onto persons closest to the offender not only invades physical integrity, ठीक है, कि acid attack of course, ठीक है, but also disrupts familial sanctity and inflicts deep psychological trauma in the family. ठीक है, सबको family के structure में डर लगेगा, right? The relief order is premised on the offender's clear liability under applicable provisions of the new penal statute, that is the Bharatiya Nyaya Sanhita, now encompassing specific sections addressing grievous hurt, cruelty, and aggravated assaults. ठीक है? The court treated the compensation as an exercise in equitable jurisdiction ancillary to criminal adjudication rather than a civil remedy requiring a separate suit. ठीक है? तो व्हाट कोर्ट डिड, ठीक है, इस क्रिमिनल एडजुडिकेशन के साथ ही, ठीक है, जो इक्विटेबल जुरिसडिक्शन विच केम अलोंग विद दिस क्रिमिनल एडजुडिकेशन, ठीक है, इन दैट केस court actually gave the compensation, ठीक है, rather than putting it as a civil remedy, ठीक है, to get the compensation in such case which would have required a separate suit. The decision draws on the principle that compensation must serve both vindictive justice है ना, as a mark of societal denunciation of that, and restorative justice, ठीक है, as a material redress to the victim. So basically what it means is कि compensation है, ठीक है, this is kind of a fine to the offender, ठीक है, तो जो wrong है ना, to punish the wrong और wrong doer, ठीक है, तो उस पे भी फाइन इन्फ्लिक्ट हो रहा है ना, which is acting as a compensation, and at the same time it should also be seen as a restorative justice, ठीक है, which is to redress or to help the victims. ठीक है, the court directed that the funds be disbursed within a specified time frame and monitored compliance, underscoring the procedural enforceability of such orders. Additionally, the court flagged that compensation serves not merely as a token, ठीक है, to the victim, but necessary adjunct to the punishment, especially where victims bear ongoing medical, rehabilitative, or psychological burdens. ठीक है, by issuing a direct compensation order, the High Court affirms trends in higher jurisprudence that instrumentalize criminal courts as forums for integrated justice. ठीक है, simply what we saw here also कि the court not only treated this compensation, ठीक है, as a criminal adjudication but also as a equitable jurisdiction, ठीक है, providing the civil remedy against or under this particular suit है ना, not to actually ट्रांसफर द कॉम्पेंसेशन वाला पार्ट टू द सिविल कोर्ट्स, ठीक है, सो this judgment, this order actually affirms the jurisprudence that instrumentalize criminal courts as forums for integrated justice, which is to convey, to punish the offender, the wrongdoer, and also providing the remedy in the same proceeding. ठीक है, the order acts as precedent for interpreting the scheme of victim relief under the Bharatiya Nyaya Sanhita era, signaling that courts may and also should assert jurisdiction to award monetary compensation in cases of intentional and aggravated bodily harm, ठीक है, without relegating the victims to the separate civil litigation. ठीक है, now quickly looking at the questions. Question number 70 says, according to the passage, what was the legal foundation for the Kerala High Court's direction to pay compensation to the victims? It was discretionary civil remedy, required the victims to file a separate civil suit? No, definitely not. It did not require the victim to file a separate civil suit. Rather, it provided the civil remedy by providing the compensation. This is wrong. It was an equitable relief except within criminal proceedings as part of the court's ancillary powers. This we discussed abhi. Thus, this is the correct answer. It was a statutory penalty imposed solely for deterrence. This is also wrong. ठीक है? Because we saw this was not solely for deterrence, but also to provide the relief to the victim. ठीक है? And it was compensation ordered under the family law proceeding. This is also wrong because this is not been talked about in the passage. ठीक है? Thus the answer is option number B. What dual purpose does the court attribute to the compensation awarded? We saw clearly in the passage. ठीक है? It says that it's served to punish the offender and to restore the victims. It functions as a form of plea, bargaining, moral apology. This is completely wrong for sure. ठीक है? It symbolizes both societal condemnation and material redress for victims. This can be true. ठीक है? Societal condemnation to the offender and also the redressal to the victims. It it can be true. It aimed to reconcile the offender and the victims through mediation. ठीक है? This is not been talked about in the passage at all. This is wrong. Now, quickly looking at these two options. ठीक है? In the options, what we can see, simply यहाँ पे जो बात हो रही है compensation की, this is not just to punish the offender. ठीक है? The purpose, ठीक है? The purpose essentially is the societal condemnation of the wrongdoer. ठीक है? By providing the compensation to the victims. Thus, this statement makes it wrong because this is not the purpose, ideal purpose. है ना? Thus, this option is more correct in for this particular question. ठीक है? Moving to question number 72, if a similar acid attack victim files a civil suit for damages, ठीक है? After the criminal court has already awarded compensation, which principle from the passage would guide the court's approach? ठीक है? The victim's civil claim must automatically be dismissed as compensation cannot be duplicated. ठीक है? This is wrong. ठीक है? क्योंकि automatically it won't be dismissed. ठीक है? The criminal court's compensation is entirely unrelated to civil remedies and must not affect them. This is also wrong. ठीक है? Because the purpose of criminal court providing compensation, ठीक है, also has an effect on the civil remedies. ठीक है? Option C says the criminal court's compensation is a substitute for a separate civil action and as both aim to provide material redress to the victims. ठीक है? Thus, this seems correct to me. Civil court must reopen the question of guilt before granting further relief. No, this is not right because the question of guilt is being already decided in the criminal court. ठीक है? And there's no need for further or reopening of the question as the criminal court itself is providing compensation. ठीक है? As a substitute for a separate civil action. ठीक है? Because अगर separate civil action होगा तो of course the victim has to go through the entire proceedings of the criminal court as well as the civil court. ठीक है? Rather, if only one court can directly provide the compensation and the relief in such cases, that is always helpful and that is the purpose. Which of the following best reflects the Kerala High Court's broader judicial philosophy as evident from the judgment? Criminal courts should confine themselves strictly to determining guilt and sentence. This is wrong because in certain cases they should also award the compensation wherever required. Integrated justice requires criminal courts to also provide reparative remedies alongside punishment. This is being talked about in the passage that we were discussing. Victim compensation should always be deferred until civil courts decide. This is wrong because criminal courts can also or should also take corrective action in providing compensation, okay, for the civil suit. Thus, this is also wrong. Judicial intervention in compensation matters violates separation of powers, which is also not correct and not being talked about in the passage. That's the correct answer is option number B. Which of the following factual scenarios would most closely align with the principles established in this case for awarding compensation? ठीक है, a minor road accident caused by negligence resulting in minor scratches. ठीक है, इस केस में तो there won't be any major criminal as well as a civil suit. ठीक है, thus this would be wrong. A deliberate attempt causing grievous bodily harm and permanent disfigurement. In this case, yes, there'll be a offense for sure, and at the same time, the compensation can be awarded to the victim. राइट, बिजनेस डिस्प्यूट इन्वॉल्विंग ब्रीच ऑफ कॉन्ट्रैक्ट एंड फाइनेंशियल लॉस, यहाँ पे कोई ऐसे रिपेरेटिव मेजर की बात नहीं है टू बी प्रोवाइडेड टू द विक्टिम. thus this is wrong. Never requiring leading to verbal abuse but no physical injury, that means यहाँ पे तो कोई क्राइम या क्रिमिनल केस की बात ही नहीं है. ठीक है, this is also wrong. Thus the correct answer is option B. Okay, moving to next passage. The Allahabad High Court has initiated contempt proceedings in response to a disparaging व्हाट्सएप मैसेज टारगेटिंग अ सिटिंग जज। ठीक है, इस प्रोसीडिंग्स में क्या ऑब्जर्व किया कोर्ट ने, दैट सच कम्युनिकेशंस especially via social media or private messaging platforms can undermine public confidence in the judiciary। ठीक है, when you message when you send disparaging messages targeting a sitting judge, this actually undermine the confidence of public in judiciary and thereby threatens the constitutional scheme of separation of powers, status of courts, and respect for judicial office. The court held that the power to punish for contempt मस्ट बी इन्वोक जुडिशियसली। ठीक है, ऐसा नहीं है कि हर किसी केस में भी, कुछ भी केस में कोई बहुत प्यूनिटिव सा ऑफेंस है, प्यूनिटिव सा कुछ एक्शन है जिसके बेस पे दैट दिस पावर कैन बी रिवोक्ड और इन्वोक्ड। ठीक है, this but that is no excuse for tolerating attacks on judges dignity that amount to scandalizing the court. Even a message circulated among a limited group may qualify as contempt if it impugns the impartiality, integrity and propriety of a judge। ठीक है, the threshold is whether the statement tends to lower the authority of the court or shake public confidence, not whether the message actually reached the very many people of the society। In its order, High Court stressed that users of digital platforms must bear heightened responsibility. Statements that might have been tolerated in private discourse become much more dangerous when easily forwarded or amplified। ठीक है, the court observed that anonymity cannot be a safe harbor। ठीक है, the rules allow ट्रेसिंग ओरिजिनेटर्स एंड इन्फोर्सिंग अकाउंटेबिलिटी। ठीक है, समवन के नॉट क्लेम कि मैंने तो भेजा नहीं था, मेरे पास फॉरवर्ड होकर मैसेज आया है, दस आई एम नॉट अकाउंटेबल। ठीक है, इट actually allows that the originators should be traced with the help of technology and to enforce the accountability of the originator as well as the person who is being accused। ठीक है, by initiating action on its own motion, that is basically the suo motu contempt, the court affirmed its role as guardian in judicial dignity and institutional integrity, which means, of course, even when nobody has filed any complaint with the court on its own can actually take action against such actions. The decision sends a firm signal that judiciary will not remain passive in the face of demeaning online commentary and that the mechanisms of content are available even for the innovative means of communication not envisaged in earlier doctrines। ठीक है, because the world is changing। ठीक है, and there have been a lot of means of communications coming up, so this mechanism, ठीक है, of contempt by the courts are available even for those modes or means of communication। ठीक है, now question says private WhatsApp group member shares a message alleging that a sitting judge favors certain lawyers for a personal gain। Now definitely we can see WhatsApp पे एक message share हुआ है। ठीक है, be it private, it doesn't matter, message reaches only 10 people, this also doesn't matter, as we saw in the passage। So according to the passage, such conduct amount to contempt। ठीक है, again the option says does not amount because confined to a small group, which is not true। ठीक है, it doesn't matter whether it is confined to a small group or not। may amount to contempt because the message questions the judge's impartiality। ठीक है, यहाँ पे बात हो रही है कि जज फेवर करता है, which actually questions the judge's impartiality and may lower public confidence। yes, so it may amount to contempt and the court has to take the case into account। ठीक है, is not contempt is wrong because it would be a contempt, can be treated as a contempt because the reason here given is WhatsApp communication is considered private discourse, but the court has highlighted that even the WhatsApp communication would be admissible as an evidence and would be treated under contempt। ठीक है, amounts to contempt only if the message is proven false through a judicial inquiry। ठीक है, this is also nowhere talked about in the passage, thus the correct answer is option number B। which of the following best captures the court's reasoning about threshold for uh, contempt। ठीक है, factor is whether reaches message reach the wide audience, this is wrong। ठीक है, because audience doesn't matter। ठीक है, even if this audience is small it would be a contempt। ठीक है, is whether the message tends to lower the authority, this is very important, which is being talked about, so this seems correct। whether the author of the message is identifiable, this is not at all correct। ठीक है, because the ये चीज court has said कि the court what we saw कि the rules allow for tracing of originators also, ठीक है, and enforcing the accountability because they just cannot claim the safe harbor of anonymity, ठीक है, कि हमें पता ही नहीं, ठीक है. Thus this is not an important factor, thus this is wrong. The decisive factor is whether the message contain direct threats or abusive language. This is also wrong because it actually says if the message actually tends to lower the authority of court or shake public confidence in the judiciary, that in itself is enough to create the liability of content, है ना, in these cases. So this is also wrong. Correct answer is option B. Now question 77 asks the court's reference to anonymity not being a safe harbor, which we abhi discussed. ठीक है, most directly implies that technological means exist to identify and hold accountable the original senders. ठीक है, which is being talked about in the passage and we recently discussed. It does not talk about anonymous criticism is legally immune because it says anonymity do not provide a safe harbor. ठीक है, this is wrong. That contempt jurisdiction cannot extend to identified individuals. This is again wrong. ठीक है, it can be extended. ठीक है, anonymity का आप नहीं ले सकते हो defense. That anonymity enhances the right to free expression of over judicial dignity. This is also wrong because this holds precedence over right to free expression. ठीक है, you just cannot, just because you have the right to free expression, you can actually send messages which can actually lower the judicial dignity. ठीक है, question number 78, which statement best explains the court's reason for invoking suo motu powers? ठीक है, to punish all online speech critical of judges? No, this is not true. ठीक है, it does not talk about all online speeches. To demonstrate that judicial dignity and institutional integrity must be actively protected. This is correct. To encourage litigants to file private contempt complaints. Again, this is wrong. This has not been talked about in the passage. To explain the definition of contempt beyond constitutional limits. Again, this has not been talked about in the passage. Thus, the correct answer is option number B. It is a very direct question. If a lawyer argues that since WhatsApp messages are private, okay, the sender cannot be guilty of contempt. However, how would the court likely respond based on the passage? Okay, as we saw, it doesn't mean or it doesn't help whether or not the WhatsApp message is private as long as the messages actually lower the authority of court है ना and undermine the public confidence in the judiciary. ठीक है, whether be it a social media platform or a private messaging platform. ठीक है, it will attract the liability. ठीक है, thus the court will not accept the argument. Thus option A and option C can be directly eliminated. Option B and D talks about rejection of the liability. Let's quickly look at the reasoning. Because even limited circulation that undermines confidence in judiciary can be contempt. This is correct. Reject but only if the message is forwarded beyond the original group. This is also not something talked about in the passage. Okay, thus the correct answer is option B. Okay, moving to the next passage. The Banking Laws Amendment Bill 2024 proposes sweeping changes to India's key banking statutes, notably the RBI Act, the Banking Regulation Act, the SBI Act, and the Acquisition Transfer of Undertaking Laws to align regulation with contemporary economic realities and strengthen deposit investor rights. A central reform is the expansion of nomination rights, which is depositors, lockers, users, and those holding assets in safe custody may now appoint up to 4 nominees. ठीक है, either simultaneously or successively. ठीक है, एक साथ आप 4 नॉमिनी कर दो, एक के बाद एक के बाद एक, up to 4 nominees you can appoint, replacing the earlier norm of a single nominee. This seeks to simplify succession and reduce legal disputes over unclaimed funds. ठीक है, the bill modernizes liquidity regulation by redefining fortnight this term for the purpose of cash reserve requirements. The current 14-day cycle based on Saturday to second Friday is replaced by two fixed calendar periods. ठीक है, पहले it used to be from Saturday to the second Friday. ठीक है, now it has been replaced with 1 to 15 and 16 to end of each month, thereby standardizing compliance and reporting. In the governance sphere, the bill raises the threshold for substantial interest, ठीक है, relevant to directorship eligibility from 5 lakh to rupees 2 crores. ठीक है, reflecting inflation and the scale of modern banking. ठीक है, in cooperative banking, the permissible consecutive tenure for non-executive directors is extended from 8 to 10 years. The director of a central cooperative bank may also serve on the board of a state cooperative bank if duly qualified. ठीक है, these are all the changes which have been brought through the Banking Laws Amendment Bill 2024. ठीक है, to enhance depositor investor protection, the bill widens the categories of unclaimed funds transferable to the Investor Education and Protection Fund. Beyond unpaid dividends, now unclaimed shares and interest or redemption amounts on bonds not claimed for 7 years also qualify for the same. ठीक है? To be transferable to the IEPF. Those whose assets are transferred retain a right to claim them back. ठीक है? So this right has also been given. Another significant shift is the autonomy granted to banks over auditor remuneration, whereas earlier the RBI, in consultation with the government, used to fix such compensation. The bill empowers banks themselves to decide, potentially improving flexibility in audit oversight. Okay? These changes carry multiple trade-offs. On the upside, they promote operational clarity, ease of compliance, and more depositor-friendly mechanisms. ठीक है, on the other hand, raising thresholds for regulatory scrutiny, जैसे हमने डायरेक्टर के केस में देखा, from 5 lakh to 2 crores, and enabling longer director tenures may dilute accountability. ठीक है, because it is easing out for them, है ना, extending tenure for non-executive directors from 8 to 10 years. ठीक है, and allowing the director of central cooperative bank to serve as in the board of state cooperative bank also. ठीक है, they can dilute accountability. Moreover, granting banks authority over auditor pay demands robust checks to avoid conflict of interest. है ना, कि अगर आप आरबीआई की अथॉरिटी हटाकर बैंक को एम्पावर कर रहे हो टू डिसाइड, ठीक है, द रेम्यूनरेशन ऑफ द ऑडिटर, इट एक्चुअली डिमांड्स एटलीस्ट सम चेक्स, है ना, ताकि कोई कॉन्फ्लिक्ट ऑफ इंटरेस्ट ना हो. इन सम, द बिल सीक्स टू रीबैलेंस रेगुलेटरी ओवरसाइट टुवर्ड्स एफिशिएंसी इन ऑटोनॉमी, but its success will heavily depend on the implementation of all the provisions which are being discussed and which are being changed through this Banking Law Amendment Bill 2024. ठीक है, and institution safeguards. ठीक है, let's quickly look at the questions. The amendment regarding the number of nominees a depositor can appoint primarily aims to limit the number of claimants to reduce confusion. No, this is not right, because it is actually being increased from 1 to 4. Restrict appointment of nominees to family members to safeguard. This is not being talked about anywhere. Elimination. Eliminate the nomination process entirely and replace it with statutory succession. This is also wrong, because ये eliminate नहीं कर रहा है, rather number of nominees a depositor can appoint is being increased from 1 to 4, allows greater flexibility, which is true, and reduce inheritance disputes by permitting multiple nominees, which is correct, because in case जब एक ही nominee हो सकता था, तब there were a lot of chances of disputes arising, but when it is increased to 4 nominees, the court assumes, or in fact the statute assumes, that the inheritance disputes will get reduced. Okay, thus D is the correct answer. If a bank director currently holds 1 crore in a company that borrows from a bank, under the amendment bill, this holding would be, it was increased from 5 lakhs to 2 crores, right? Thus, it would not be considered substantial interest. ठीक है, this is wrong. ठीक है, क्योंकि 2 crore होनी चाहिए. ठीक है, since the amendment eliminates the fixed threshold, ऐसा भी नहीं है, it does not eliminate it, rather it is increased from 5 lakhs to 2 crores. Disregarded, as the rule applies only to cooperative banks. This is also not true, it applies to all the banks. ठीक है, thus the correct answer is option C, which is that it would not be considered as a substantial interest, as it is below the revised 2 crore threshold put by the bill. Which of the following best encaptures the legislative intent behind redefining fortnight to for cash regulation? We saw this is being done to actually, what we saw here, to actually standardize compliance and reporting. ठीक है, thus they want to create a uniform and fixed reporting periods, है ना, and which actually standardize the compliance. ठीक है, Thus, this is the correct answer. ठीक है? It does not allow banks to hold reserve for longer periods. ठीक है? Fortnite redefine करने का intent was never this to enable banks to choose any convenient window. This is also not true because up the window would be 1 to 15 and 16 to the end of month. To synchronize reserve calculations with government fiscal quarters, this is also wrong. ठीक है? Moving to question number 83. A central cooperative bank director, ठीक है, Mr. R is nominated to serve on the board of State Cooperative Bank. Under the bill, her eligibility depends primarily on, ठीक है, basically if we see, ठीक है, may serve, passage is may serve if duly qualified, ठीक है, that means the director of that central cooperative bank must duly qualify to become or to serve on the board of State Cooperative Bank. ठीक है, quickly looking at the options. She has completed 10 consecutive years. ये कहीं क्राइटेरिया मेंशन नहीं है पैसेज में. Held a substantial interest. ये भी कहीं मेंशन नहीं है because this substantial interest is being talked about directors in any bank, not just state cooperative bank. ठीक है, with a threshold of rupees 2 crores. ठीक है, thus this is also wrong. Whether the RBI grants explicit approval. ठीक है, passage does not talk about any approval required from RBI. Whether she meets the prescribed qualification criteria for the state cooperative bank directors, which is correctly directly from the passage. Unclaimed shares or interest on bonds that remain unclaimed over 7 years are to be transferred to IEPF. ठीक है, this we saw. This reform primarily reflects reduction in the liability obligation of bank towards investors. This is not wrong. This is very unrelated to the question that is being asked. ठीक है, transfer of all dormant bank accounts to government control. This is also wrong. ठीक है, because these accounts, the funds are transferred to IEPF. Abolition of investor rights to reclaim transferred assets. The rights have not been abolished. Rather, they have the right to claim the transferred assets back as discussed in the passage. Okay, from this line. So last option is expansion of depositor investor protection mechanism. This is the right answer. All right, so let's quickly move to the fourth section, that is logical reasoning. Let's quickly read out the passage. First one we can see was a critical reasoning based passage. It says mental health is often treated as the private backdrop to maintain marriages, yet it shapes daily negotiations of care, money, intimacy, and duty. Marriage can buffer distress through companionship, shared income, and kin support. Right? It can also magnify vulnerabilities. A partner's depression can be read as laziness, anxiety as disrespect, trauma as obstinacy. Silence becomes the third person in the room. For many women, marriage offers status and security, but also a long workday of unpaid care. The expectation to perform cheerfulness can mask postpartum depression or burnout. Men, socialized to appear invulnerable, right, may express pain through irritability or alcohol use and are less likely to seek help. In joint families, elders can be anchors of wisdom, yet they can also police behavior and limit privacy. ठीक है, so they are talking about dual role of elders in joint families. ठीक है, the picture is mixed for love marriage and arranged one. ठीक है, the urban apartments and small towns. ठीक है, for any contrasting two things, the picture is almost mixed. Religion and community networks provide rituals of solidarity, but they can also pressure couples to stay regardless of harm. Counselors report that in-law conflict is as common as marital conflict. ठीक है, LGBTQ plus couples face the additional strain of legal uncertainty and family secrecy, which turns ordinary disagreements into existential questions. Technology gives support groups and teletherapy, but it also imports comparison culture through glossy reels about perfect spouses. ठीक है. Again, duology or dual factor or dual effect of technology. ठीक है. Policy tends to enter late. ठीक है, at the point of dowry harassment, domestic violence or divorce. ठीक है. We need earlier dose. ठीक है. What it talks about it, usually the policy or the law comes into picture at the point, at the later stage, when it comes to dowry harassment or violence and such cases. But we actually need earlier dose of or earlier recourse against these things. Primary health centers could screen for depression and intimate partner violence and refer both partners to low cost counseling. Employers could include couples therapy in insurance. है ना? Courts that favor mediation should be careful not to convert mediation into moral pressure. Religious institutions and community groups can host mental health literacy sessions without intruding into private choice. The hardest task is cultural. We must rewrite the idea that a good marriage is one where nothing is wrong. है ना? ऐसा नहीं है कि good marriage is always ideal. A good marriage is one where something can be wrong and be spoken about. The vocabulary of care, apology, and boundaries is not the enemy of tradition. है ना? It is tradition learning to breathe. Listening early together may prevent cruelty later and preserve ordinary joy for years. ठीक है. So we saw in this entire passage it talked about marriage. ठीक है, outcomes of marriage, है ना? And in case where mental health is also involved in Indian marriages, and what are the outcomes and how different factors like elders in the family, technology, policies, courts, and all those things enter or affect these marriages. ठीक है. Let's quickly look at the question. What is the central idea of the passage? Are primarily weakened by rise of love marriage. This is wrong. Are largely individual problems that should be kept separate from mental damage. This is also wrong. It permeates Indian marital life, sometimes buffering, sometimes magnifying distress, and requires earlier systematic and cultural responses that enable open conversation that we can directly see in the passage. ठीक है. Because it talked about we need earlier doors in such cases, and it also talked about that buffering of distress. ठीक है. Thus correct is option C. Which statement would the author most strongly disagree with? ठीक है. You have to pay attention to the question. It asks the statement with which the author would most strongly disagree with. ठीक है. Given the discussion on courts and mediation. ठीक है. Mediation should aim to reduce adversarial escalation where safe and voluntary. Of course, this is something that the author agrees with. ठीक है. Court may encourage mediated resolution by maintaining parties' autonomy. ठीक है. This is also something that author agrees with. Mediation is effective only when it results in rapid reconciliation irrespective of context. ठीक है. This is also something that author agrees with. Quote that favor mediation must avoid turning into moral pressure it into to stay together. ठीक है. This is something that author does not agree with. Thus, this is the correct answer. Which evidence most strongly supports the claim that technology has a dual effect on couples' mental health, which we discussed while reading the passage, right? Again, कि दोनों चीजें हो सकती है टेक्नोलॉजी से. इट कैन बी गुड और इट कैन हैव अ बैड इफेक्ट एज वेल. ठीक है. नाउ वी कैन डायरेक्टली सी ओनली वन ऑप्शन talks about technology, which is it provides support groups and telepathy while also importing comparison culture via glossy reels, which is directly being talked about in the passage. ठीक है. Here we can see it support groups and telepathy but imports comparison through glossy reels. ठीक है. Thus the correct answer is option number B, because other options, this option talk about urban apartments, this option talks about reporting in-law conflicts, and this talks about religion offers, which all of three which have nothing to do with technology. ठीक है. Moving to question 88, which of the following cannot be inferred from the author's discussion on joint families. ठीक है. Now quickly looking at the options again, something to note that it asks for which of the following cannot be inferred. ठीक है. We'll have to see what all things which the author is inferring or we can infer from the author's discussion. Joint family can at times constrain privacy in ways that affect mental health disclosure. Of course, this can be inferred. Elders in joint family may provide stabilizing guidance that buffer distress. This can also be inferred. Living in a joint family uniformly protects couples from marital strain. Okay, this seems wrong. Okay, because what we saw that it actually provides a mixed picture, but not only uniformly protecting couples from marital strain. So this is something which cannot be inferred. Thus, this is the correct answer. Moving to question 89, which intervention or measure is proposed in the passage to handle the problem that policy tends to enter late? Okay, we discussed that it should come early. We saw here that the passage author talks about that we actually need earlier doors. Looking at the question, increasing penalties at the point of divorce to deter filings. This is also not करेक्ट ठीक है to problem we need early exits point of divorce पे तो already होता है that this is wrong integrated routine screening for depression and intimate partner violence at primary health centers with referral to low cost counseling for again correct है because this actually provides for a early stage recourse ठीक है thus this can be correct mandating leaders to approve separations before court this is not right encouraging families to resolve it privately without professionals this is also wrong because we have talked about primary healthcare centers in the passage the argument about early screening at primary health centers relies on which of the following assumptions okay again as we discussed in the last question also and also while reading the passage, mental health and safety concerns often manifest before crises like these, dowry, harassment, domestic violence, actually become visible to the legal system. Okay? All these come late or at a later stage, which we discussed. Rather, they should come at early stages. ठीक है thus it is very important है ना to have early screening at primary healthcare centers ठीक है thus this is the correct answer we can see it says it's caused by lack of religious rituals which is wrong insurance will automatically eliminate again we cannot this can be one of the factors or tool but it cannot serve as one factor which can automatically eliminate this conflict okay elders invariably worsen this is also wrong because in the passage we have talked about two-way rule of elders moving to next passage indian cricket's rising standards are visible in scorecards but more clearly in the texture of play 2 generations ago a domestic seaman looked for helpful mornings in mohali today a teenager from Ranchi tweaks wrist position after consulting high speed footage then bowls at 140 kilometers per hour in a club match ठीक है what they're doing they're making the use of technology in the current days. The bar has moved through money, science, and sheer competition. Okay. The IPL attracts the world's best coaches and exposes uncapped Indian players to pressure that was once rare outside an Indian shirt. ठीक है पहले इंडिया शर्ट जब नेशनल टीम के लिए खेलते थे only then they used to get exposed to world's best coaches ठीक है and all those things which actually create you or used to create pressure among those players है ना bench strength is no longer a cliche it is a daily contest for contracts है ना because competition has increased a lot because of all these technological advancements money and science ठीक है Yet the same marketplace can flatten technique and reward risk patterns suited to shorter formats. Okay, white ball influency does not always translate into red ball patience. Selection panels must resist the temptation to treat formats as interchangeable. Okay, they must not treat these formats as interchangeable. Domestic structures deserve more credit that they get. The Ranji Trophy has become faster and fitter with better outfields मैच फीस एंड स्ट्रीमिंग दैट शाइन्स लाइट ऑन वंस anonymous performance ठीक है पहले there did not used to be any there was no streaming at all right match fees was low the outfields were not great and that is the reason people did not even get to know about these matches earlier है ना. Still, scheduling squeezes recovery in these domestic matches, especially the Ranji Trophy, which is oscillate between underprepared turners and docile carpets because of the schedule things. ठीक है, because the matches are conducted so frequently that even the staff do not get time to prepare the pitches. Umpiring standards have also improved, but at the same time, depth remains thin when three tournaments run simultaneously. Investment in curators, trainers, and officials is as important as another indoor academy. ठीक है, there's a mental side to standards also. Younger players arrive with polished media skills and data literacy. ठीक है, they also carry the strain of constant comparison and a fleeting window to impress, है ना, through their skills. Workload management also needs honest dialogue between franchisee and selectors. ठीक है, especially when we talk about these domestic leagues as well as IPL. Not press conference signaling. ठीक है, you just talk about in press conference. Rather, that actually have to be honest dialogue between the franchises and the selectors, how to manage the workload of players. Injuries expose the gap between cutting edge rehab in national camps and uneven support at state level, है ना. The women's game is also rising at its own arc. ठीक है, पहले we saw it talked about the standards of Indian cricket rising, then it talked about IPL and different formats, है ना. Then it talked about domestic cricket, then it talked about mental side to it, है ना, workload management and injury. Now the passage has moved to women's cricket, है ना. The new league has accelerated skills and visibility, but pathways in schools and district remain patchy. ठीक है, it says कि यार लीग लेवल पे तो the game has risen, है ना, काफी लीग्स होने लगी हैं, स्किल्स इंप्रूव हुई हैं, बट इफ वी सी एटलीस्ट फॉर वुमेन क्रिकेट इन स्कूल्स एंड डिस्ट्रिक्ट, ठीक है, स्टिल द पाथवे इज पैची. ठीक है, बिकॉज नो बडी पेज मच हीट टू women playing cricket. Genuine excellence needs a pyramid, not a skyscraper. ठीक है, it's not possible कि directly the interest in women's game, ठीक है, rises like a skyscraper. Rather, it has to be a pyramid, gradually increasing. At its best, Indian cricket's rise is not a story of inevitable ascent, but of collective learning. Set higher goals, yes, of course, that's important. And also ask better questions. That how these goals are pursued. Okay, not only setting higher goals is okay, but also how to pursue or achieve those goals is as important. Standards rise when ambition is matched by care. That balance will decide whether depth becomes durability across formats and years to come. Quickly looking at the questions. First question says, which sentence best sums up the author's main message through the passage? It first option says is inevitable because of money and star coaches, which is wrong. It is not inevitable because of that. And now it is because of collective learning. Rise when ambition is balanced with care across formats and structure. This is being talked about in the passage is the main idea of the author that we saw. Thus, this is the correct answer. Okay, IPL is not the sole engine and they should not prioritize T20 skills. Moving to next question. Which new piece of evidence would most clearly support the author's worry about format spillover? ठीक है, जो इशू आ रहा है इंटरचेंजेबिलिटी ऑफ फॉर्मेट्स, ठीक है, कौन सा ऐसा एविडेंस होगा विच वुड सपोर्ट द ऑथर्स वरी? ठीक है, अराइज इन आईपीएल टेलीविजन रेटिंग्स, ठीक है, दिस वुड नॉट सपोर्ट. Why? Because this would say कि हाँ मतलब they should play more and more IPL. So this is wrong. Players reporting higher confidence after franchise games. This would also not hold true. A faster average bowling speed among domestic pacers. This is also not a good piece of evidence, ठीक है, about format spillover, because this actually talks about different formats, ठीक है, and managing the skills for all the formats. Data showing batters with excellent T20 strike rates struggle to convert starts in Ranji Trophy 4-day games, which clearly show the contrast between skills needed in different formats of the game, and which is actually the author's worry throughout the passage. Okay, thus the correct answer is option D, right? Moving to question 93 from the author's comment on domestic competitions, what follows most reasonably? ठीक है, funding and training are as crucial as building more academics. Yes, more academies. This is very true. We can directly infer this from the passage. Student issues are inevitable. This is wrong because they are not inevitable. ठीक है, they can be improved. It should be paused when other tournaments run. This is also not true. Rather, there should be a balanced focus on all type of tournaments and all type of formats. Streaming alone will fix. Okay. Again, this can be one of the fixes, but this alone cannot fix the problems. Okay. So this is also wrong. What practical step does the author most clearly favor for managing player workload? Okay. अब author has talked about many, है ना, but announcing strict annual match caps in press conferences, again this is something that author is against. Leaving all workload calls to franchises, nahi, again there should be a joint call between the franchisee as we discussed and the selectors. ठीक है, honest direct coordination between franchise and selectors, yes this is correct, which was missing here. Assigning one trainer to all three concurrent tournaments is also not the solution. The answer is option C. What is the main bottleneck identified in the women's pathway? Again, this can directly be seen as patchy school and district level pathways beneath the league, okay, which is clearly mentioned in the passage itself. The advice to resist treating formats as interchangeable relies on which assumption? Okay, again reading the question, the advice to resist treating formats as interchangeable relies on which assumption? Okay, players prefer T20 contract test caps, ऐसा तो कहीं भी mention नहीं है. Selectors only watch IPL when choosing spots, this is also nowhere mentioned. ठीक है, and it cannot also be an assumption. ठीक है, to resist these formats as interchangeable. Training time is equal for all formats. ठीक है, this cannot also be an assumption which holds true. Skills and risk patterns do not automatically transfer from white ball to red ball cricket, as can be seen that a player good with T20 format may not do well in longer format, right? Thus, and in fact, because skills required in different formats are also different, you know, and they cannot be automatically transferred. Thus, the correct answer is option D. Okay, now we have got a arithmetic reasoning का question which says analytical reasoning का question. Analytical reasoning का question में we can see a puzzle where five students Anya, Bhavesh, Chaitanya, Chetan, Diya and Ishan. Can we write them as A, B, C, D, and E? They belong to five different states: Gujarat, Kerala, Rajasthan, Tamil Nadu, and West Bengal, and prefer doing five CLAT subjects, namely English, current affairs, legal reasoning, logical reasoning, and quantitative techniques, not necessarily in the same order. The following information is given. Let's quickly make a table for the same. ठीक है, मैं एक टेबल बना लेता हूँ. ये मेरे पांच स्टूडेंट्स हैं, ठीक है, which belong to different states and they prefer different subject. ठीक है, quickly looking at the information given. The student who prefers current affairs is from Gujarat. ठीक है, मैं यहाँ पे लिख देता हूँ, करंट अफेयर्स वाला है गुजरात से. भावेश प्रिफर्स quantitative techniques. ठीक है, I can directly write quantitative techniques and belong to a state that borders Gujarat. ठीक है, now let's see option point 7 says Rajasthan among the given states border Gujarat, है ना, that means Bhavesh is from Rajasthan. ठीक है, this point is done. Student from Kerala prefers logical reasoning, तो मैं लिखता हूँ यहाँ logical is from Kerala. Anya is neither from Gujarat. Anya is not from Gujarat. ठीक है, और and not from West Bengal also. She prefers the only language subject that is English. ठीक है, तो मेरे को आने का सब्जेक्ट दिया हुआ है which is English. ईशान prefers the reasoning subject but not legal reasoning. Legal reasoning के अलावा only reasoning subject is logical reasoning. ठीक है, which I can see logical reasoning वाला is from Kerala, so he must be from Kerala. ठीक है, तो this is done. Now मुझे गिवन है आने इज नॉट फ्रॉम गुजरात एंड वेस्ट बंगाल, केरला एंड राजस्थान ऑलरेडी हो गए हैं, ठीक है, मेरे पास गुजरात से नहीं है, वेस्ट बंगाल से नहीं है, केरला हो चुका है, राजस्थान हो चुका है, दैट मीन्स ओनली स्टेट लेफ्ट इज तमिलनाडु, ठीक है। नाउ ईशान ये हमारा हो गया है, चेतन इज नॉट फ्रॉम गुजरात, तो चेतन गुजरात से नहीं है, तो ओनली स्टेट लेफ्ट अपार्ट फ्रॉम गुजरात नाउ इज वेस्ट बंगाल, दिस मीन्स डी दिया मस्ट बी फ्रॉम गुजरात। मैंने देखा गुजरात वाला क्या प्रेफर करता है, करंट अफेयर्स, दिस मीन्स सी चेतन प्रेफर्स लीगल रीजन, ठीक है। दिस इज द entire solution for or the table for the puzzle, ठीक है। लेट्स क्विकली लुक एट द क्वेश्चंस। हु प्रिफर्स करंट अफेयर्स प्रेफर करता है डी, डी से कौन दिया, दिस मींस आंसर इज ऑप्शन डी, दिया, ठीक है। देन नेक्स्ट क्वेश्चन, विच स्टेट डस आने बिलोंग टू, आने का चेक कर लेते हैं, आने बिलोंग्स टू तमिलनाडु, दस द करेक्ट आंसर इज टी, तमिलनाडु। देन विच सब्जेक्ट डस ईशान प्रेफर, ईशान का देखते हैं, ईशान प्रेफर्स लॉजिकल रीजनिंग, which means correct answer is option C, logical reasoning. The student from Rajasthan prefers which subject? Quickly seeing, Rajasthan prefers QT, which is Bhavesh. ठीक है, this means quantitative techniques. ठीक है, which pair is correct? आन्या गुजरात, भावेश केरला, क्या आन्या गुजरात से है? नो, आन्या is from Tamil Nadu, भावेश is from Rajasthan. Chetan West Bengal, is it correct? Yes, Chetan is from West Bengal. Thus, this is correct. The correct answer is option C. Chetan is belongs to West Bengal. Next question is who's from Kerala. Let's quickly see. Kerala, so we can see Ishan is from Kerala. Okay, so correct answer is Ishan. That is option number D. Right? This is what happens in analytical reasoning problems. कोई problem है, कोई puzzle है, quickly try to solve it out in 2 to 3 minutes. उसके बाद if you are able to figure out the unique solution to that puzzle, ठीक है, then you can easily answer all the questions. Quickly moving to the next passage, which is again a critical reasoning passage, ठीक है, which says financial education now travels like a miracle cure in India, है ना, packaged as school modules, influencer reels, and workplace seminars. The promise is irresistible. Teach citizens the basics of budgeting, compounding, and risk, and households will save more as a result of it, and borrow prudently and invest for the long term. There's truth here. Literacy actually lowers the cost of asking questions, and a citizen who understands interest and inflation is less likely to fall prey to predatory loans or improbable schemes. Yet, despite of this fact, finance is not a neutral language that simply needs translation. ठीक है, ऐसा नहीं है simply translate करके समझा दिया and they will understand. It is also a set of choices framed by power. Households face medical shocks, insecure jobs, and volatile prices. No mnemonic can stabilize incomes that arrive late or evaporate without notice. ठीक है, because you don't have the entire control over your expenditures. When education is sold as solution, the burden shifts from institutions to individuals, implying that default is a personal failure rather than a symptom of thin social protection and uneven regulation. ठीक है, यहाँ पे द ऑथर इज ट्राइंग टू से, ठीक है, जब एज अ सॉल्यूशन टू फाइनेंशियल लिटरेसी, ठीक है, एजुकेशन को बेचा जा रहा है कि आप पढ़ लो, आप सब कुछ सीख जाओ, ठीक है, तो जो बर्डन है ऑफ अंडरस्टैंडिंग, ठीक है, दैट शिफ्ट्स टू द इंडिविजुअल्स, कि यार अगर कुछ गलत हो रहा है ना, दैट इज बिकॉज ऑफ द पर्सनल फेलियर्स, है ना, नॉट बिकॉज कि सोसाइटी हैज फेल्ड टू प्रोवाइड द प्रोटेक्शन और द रेगुलेशंस हैव failed to provide protection to the individuals. ठीक है, consider a crowded marketplace of digital lending apps and investment products. ठीक है, a literate user may still confront dark patterns, hidden fees and persuasive nudges. है ना, कोई पढ़ा भी है जिसको फाइनेंशियल लिटरेसी भी है, they can also get trapped to these hidden fees and dark patterns. ठीक है, disclosed documents even when read rarely match the intensity of marketing. ठीक है, the marketing is so heavy that people often tend to ignore the disclosures in the documents also. Teaching citizens to recognize risk is helpful, of course, but teaching those firms which actually take the responsibility to educate people, है ना, teaching them to respect boundaries through enforcement may be more effective. ठीक है, again this is helpful, they are not completely eliminating the task of teaching citizens, but the author thinks that teaching the firms to respect boundaries would be more effective. Education without credible deterrence produces cleverer victims. यहाँ पे it's making mockery that कि आप एजुकेट तो कर रहे हो, ठीक है, बट एक क्रेडिबल वो नहीं है, तो क्या हो रहा है, लोग एजुकेट हो जा रहे हैं, दे आर बिकमिंग क्लेवर, ठीक है, येट दे आर बिकमिंग विक्टिम्स टू दीज पॉलिसीज, ठीक है, नन ऑफ दिस आर्ग्यूज अगेंस्ट फाइनेंशियल लिटरेसी, ठीक है, अगेन दीज आर्ग्यूमेंट्स आर नॉट अगेंस्ट फाइनेंशियल लिटरेसी, लिटरेसी होनी ही नहीं चाहिए, बट इट एक्चुअली आर्ग्यूज फॉर लोकेटिंग इट विद इन अ वाइडर पॉलिसी फ्रेम, ठीक है, फॉर दोज फर्म्स हु आर टीचिंग. Households benefit when curricula are tied to real decisions they face, such as choosing between an informal loan and a credit union or evaluating a buy now pay later offer for a motorbike. Community coaches, vernacular content, and helplines can translate theory into timely counsel. Okay, these are some of the methods that author is saying, you know, how the situation can be improved. ठीक है, the fair test is not how many certificates are issued, है ना, मतलब education में what happens is कि you have a course, आपने करा, certificate मिल गया, ठीक है, you say 100% of them got pass certificate, but है ना, this is not a fair test because ultimately it comes down to practicality of it, है ना. So the test is to whether these bad products exist in the market and the good products become simpler to use for all the people, है ना. Regulators also must elevate plain language, ठीक है, in all the policies and documents, curb misleading incentives and make quick redressal. Only then does education becomes a public good rather than a private shield, and a tool that dignifies choice instead of excusing neglect. The task ultimately is to pair literacy with fair design, fair markets, and floor of security that cushions ordinary risk. What is the central idea of the passage? We can clearly see, of course, financial literacy is useful, but insufficient on its own, right? Because केवल उनको literate कर देना doesn't help, ठीक है? Until unless they get to learn the practicality of it, ठीक है? And in fact, the enforcement for the firms, ठीक है, to to use fair market practices, है ना, is also necessary alongside. Thus, the correct answer to option B. Mass scale financial education delivered through schools and education by itself cannot curb. This is wrong. ठीक है. Main barrier to household is ignorance of compounding. ठीक है. Which literacy alone can rectify, again. This is wrong. ठीक है. क्योंकि बहुत ज़्यादा extreme option है. Regulators should replace financial education with punitive crackdowns that eliminate bad products outright. ठीक है. No, their focus is not only to replace financial education or not to replace financial education, but to complement financial education with these restrictive measures. ठीक है. Thus this is also wrong. Question 104, which statement would the author most strongly disagree with given the discussion on digital lending apps? ठीक है, तो let's see किस किस से agree करता है. Clear disclosures if vetted by regulators are sufficient. ठीक है, definitely इससे agree तो नहीं करता है. Only these things are not sufficient to neutralize these marketing and dark patterns. ठीक है, so this should be the correct answer. ठीक है, even financial literate users can be steered by fear and peace. We saw that. So इससे तो agree करता है. Enforcement that constraints from can usefully complement education, we talked about it, thus agree करता है. Teaching citizens to recognize risk, है ना, is important, valuable, but cannot substitute for oversight by the regulators, इससे भी agree करता है. So the correct answer is option A. ठीक है, moving to next question. Which evidence most strongly supports the claim that teaching firms to respect boundaries through enforcement may be more effective? ठीक है, we talked about it कि of course both things are important, the education as well as the enforcement to teach the firms to respect boundaries. ठीक है, but which is evidence mostly or most strongly supports this claim of the author? Let's see. National survey that shows that after a semester long module, 80% of the participants again it's only based on education and certificate वाली चीज which we talked about. ठीक है, it does not support the claim that uh, teaching or talk about teaching firm to respect boundaries through enforcement. This is wrong. Cross country study finds that jurisdictions mandating school based financial literacy, again it only talks about school based financial literacy, है ना, thus this is also wrong. Case study of a cooperative shows savings rose after vernacular coaching and community meetings, again it only talks about education. This is wrong. To support the claim about enforcement, ठीक है, a randomized trial finds platforms facing credible fines cut hidden fees and dark patterns prompts by 40%. ठीक है, this actually talks about enforcement measures, ठीक है, by implementing fines, है ना, while users literacy scores did not change. ठीक है, तो education से कोई ज्यादा फर्क नहीं पड़ा, ठीक है, लिटरेसी स्कोर्स उनके सेम रहे, बट दिस इन्फोर्समेंट एक्चुअली cut the hidden fees and these dark pattern prompts by 40%. Thus, supports a claim about this enforcement. Thus, the correct answer is option D. Which of the following cannot be inferred from the author's discussion on measuring the success of, again, question asked cannot be inferred. Okay, on measuring the success of financial education. Counting course completions or certificate is an inadequate sole metric of success. यहाँ पे inadequate की बात की है, which can be inferred. Good financial products become simpler to use is an outcome of author values. This is also something that can be inferred from author's discussion. Reducing the overall diversity of available financial products is the clearest sign that education is working. This is wrong. This is something that cannot be inferred. Faster, effective redress mechanism align with the author's preferred reform outcomes. This also can be inferred. Thus, the correct answer is option C. What is meant by education without credible deterrence? Produces cleverer victims. This is something we talked about while discussing the passage, right? Which we saw कि एजुकेशन तो हो रही है, ठीक है, सो नॉलेज इज इंक्रीजिंग, ठीक है, बट अगेन दिस डजंट इंश्योर, ठीक है, दैट दे डोंट फॉल विक्टिम टू द पॉलिसीज, टू द मार्केटिंग, ठीक है. So we can clearly see in option B the firm behavior isn't constant. More knowledgeable consumers can also still be exploited by increasingly sophisticated tactics. Thus the answer is option B. Which intervention or measure is proposed in the passage to handle the mismatch between intense marketing and weak disclosure? Require all literacy programs to and with a standard certification. Again, this is something which cannot handle at all. ठीक है, we saw कि certificate in itself is not sufficient. Replace digital finance with only traditional branch banking to limit exposure to it. This is also something that we can do in the contemporary world. Launch larger influencer campaigns teaching mnemonics for reading offer documents. Again, this only would not be able to, ठीक है, act as a measure, है ना, to handle that mismatch, है ना. Elevate plain language requirements, curb misleading incentives and ensure quick redress through regulatory enforcement. Again, यहाँ पे बात आ रही है enforcement की, which is discussed as an important factor in the passage, है ना, in order to curb, है ना, or handle that mismatch between marketing and weak disclosure. So the correct answer is option D. All right, so let's move to the next section, which is quantitative techniques. Let's look at the first information, first data that is being given. It says a farmer producer organization FPO procured 1200 tons of paddy, ठीक है, in week 1 at 22 rupees 2200 per quintal, that is per ton बात करें तो 22,000 per ton. At the mill, 2% moisture reduction applied to the procured weight. Post reduction input was milled. Milled का जो each 100 kg का input होता है उसमें से 67 kg rice आता है, 20 kg husk and bran आता है, remainder is a waste. So remainder would be 67 plus 20, 87, 100 minus 87 is 13. ठीक है. The FPO's transport cost was 300 per ton of procured paddy and milling cost given है. All output was sold at 35 per kg. Week 2 का डेटा दिया है, ठीक है. Let's quickly make a table and see, ठीक है. Week 1 procure कितना हुआ 1200 टन्स, राइट। इसकी कॉस्ट क्या थी? एट रुपीज 2200, सॉरी, रुपीज 22,000 पर टन, ठीक है। 2% मॉइस्चर डिडक्शन है, ठीक है, एंड उसमें से 2% इज, अब वी कैन डायरेक्टली सी फ्रॉम दिस क्वेश्चन कि हमें काफी कैलकुलेशन करनी पड़ेगी। सो लेट्स प्रॉब्ली लुक एट द क्वेश्चन, है ना, क्वेश्चन के बेसिस पे विल प्रॉब्ली कैलकुलेट। नाउ फर्स्ट क्वेश्चन सेज राइस प्रोड्यूस्ड इन वीक 1 वाज क्लोजेस्ट टू, ठीक है। वीक 1 में राइस प्रोडक्शन कितना था? तो व्हाट विल डू, विल सी सबसे पहले तो कितना हमने प्रोक्योर किया था। प्रोक्योर किया था 1200 टन्स, राइट, जिसमें से 2% वॉइस मॉइस्चर डिडक्शन, दैट मीन्स कि 1200 में से केवल 98% मेरा रहा आफ्टर डिडक्शन ऑफ मॉइस्चर, तो इट वुड बी 1200 मल्टीप्लाइड बाय 0.98, विच वुड बी रफली अराउंड, अगर आप कैलकुलेट करोगे 1200, 12 into 100 1200, 12 into 2 24, this should be around 1176 is equal to 1176 ton, ठीक है। नाउ इट सेज फॉर ईच 100 kg ऑफ दिस इनपुट मिल यील्डेड 67 kg, ठीक है। तो मेरे पास अगर यहाँ पे है 1176 टन ऑफ इनपुट, जिसमें से व्हाट आई एम सेइंग इज कि 67% इज राइस, है ना, मतलब 67% हाउ, फॉर एवरी 100 kg ऑफ आउटपुट, ठीक है, 67 kg इज राइस, thus it must be 67% of the entire output, ठीक है। आउटपुट मेरा कितना है 1176, तो मेरा आंसर क्या आएगा 1176 मल्टीप्लाइड बाय 0.67 इज इक्वल टू, अगर आप कैलकुलेट करोगे इट वुड बी रफली अराउंड 787.92, विच इज रफली अराउंड 788 टन्स, ठीक है। तो करेक्ट आंसर इज ऑप्शन बी। मूविंग टू नेक्स्ट क्वेश्चन, रेवेन्यू फ्रॉम हस्क एंड ब्रांड एंड वीक 2 इक्वल्स, ठीक है। वीक 2 का देखते हैं। वीक 2 में ये बोल रहे हैं प्रोक्योरमेंट वाज 25% हायर, यहाँ पे वीक 1 में 1200 था, तो वीक 2 में प्रोक्योरमेंट कितना होगा 1200 मल्टीप्लाइड बाय 5/4, ठीक है, विच वुड बी इक्वल टू 1500, ठीक है। आप क्या बोल रहे हैं, एट द सेम पैडी प्राइस, ठीक है, प्राइस सेम थी, हमसे क्वेश्चन में पूछा गया है रेवेन्यू फ्रॉम हस्क एंड ब्रांड, तो हस्क एंड ब्रांड का निकाल लेते हैं। मॉइस्चर डिडक्शन रोज टू 3%, तो मॉइस्चर डिडक्शन के बाद मेरे पास कितना निकला इनपुट 1500 मल्टीप्लाइड बाय 0.97, अगेन इट्स नॉट अ वेरी डिफिकल्ट क्वेश्चन बट थोड़ा कैलकुलेशन हैवी, विच शुड बी 15 into 1 1500, ठीक है, एंड 15 3 is 45, तो 1500 minus 45 is 1455 टन, ठीक है। अब इसके बाद वी कैन सी हस्किन ब्रांड का कितना परसेंटेज है, विच इज 19%, इसका मैंने किया 19%, ठीक है, विच शुड बी रफली अराउंड 276.45 आफ्टर यू कैलकुलेटेड, ठीक है। मेरे पास इतना हस्किन ब्रांड बचा। नाउ क्या कॉस्ट एंड क्या सेलिंग प्राइस थी, राइस वाज सोल्ड एट दिस, अदर कॉस्ट एंड assumptions वर अनचेंज्ड, दैट मीन्स वी हैव टू सी वीक 1 में हस्क एंड ब्रांड क्या रेट से सेल हुआ था, विच इज गिवन एट सोल्ड एट 1200 per ton, so this would be 276.45 tons multiplied by rupees 1200, ठीक है, and this should come around, it will come around rupees 3,31,740, ठीक है, सिंपल है। नेक्स्ट इज क्रॉस प्रॉफिट इन वीक 1, विच इज क्रॉस प्रॉफिट कैसे निकालेंगे हम, बेसिकली जो भी रेवेन्यू हुआ टोटल माइनस जो मेरी प्रोक्योरमेंट कॉस्ट थी, मेरी ट्रांसपोर्ट कॉस्ट थी और मेरी बिलिंग कॉस्ट थी, ठीक है। मैं कैसे निकालूंगा इसको, क्विकली लुकिंग एट द डेटा, मैंने प्रोक्योर किया था, मुझसे वीक 1 का पूछा जा रहा है, तो मैंने प्रोक्योर कितना किया था, 1200 टन्स एट 22,000 पर टन। ठीक है, तो मेरी, हम अलग अलग फैक्टर्स लिख देते हैं यहाँ पे। रेवेन्यू, ठीक है, इसमें से हम माइनस करेंगे प्रोक्योरमेंट कॉस्ट। प्रोक्योरमेंट का मेरा कितना खर्चा था पैडी का, 1200 टन्स मल्टीप्लाइड बाय 22,000 पर टन। ठीक है, ट्रांसपोर्ट कितना था, मिलिंग कितना था, ट्रांसपोर्ट कॉस्ट मेरी क्या थी, लेट्स क्विकली लुक एट इट। मैंने 1200 टन्स मंगाया, ट्रांसपोर्ट कॉस्ट है 300 पर टन ऑफ प्रोक्योर्ड पैडी। ठीक है, मैंने प्रोक्योर किया है 1200, 300 पर टन उसकी ट्रांसपोर्ट कॉस्ट है, तो दिस वुड बी 1200 मल्टीप्लाइड बाय 300। ठीक है, क्विकली लुकिंग एट द मिलिंग कॉस्ट। मिलिंग कॉस्ट कहाँ पे है, मिलिंग कॉस्ट वॉज 500 पर टन ऑफ राइस प्रोड्यूस्ड। ठीक है, क्वेश्चन नंबर 1 में हमने राइस प्रोडक्शन निकाला था वीक 1 का, विच वॉज 787.92 और रफली अराउंड 788। ठीक है, उसका 500 पर टन, तो मिलिंग कॉस्ट मेरी क्या होगी, 500 per ton for 787.92 tons of rice। ठीक है, नाउ क्विकली लुकिंग एट द रेवेन्यू। रेवेन्यू मेरा कितना होगा, रेवेन्यू मैं देख रहा हूँ कि जो भी मेरा इनपुट आता है 100 केजी का, जिसमें से राइस निकलता है, कुछ कुछ हस्क एंड ब्रांड निकलता है, रिमाइंडर वेस्ट हो जाता है, तो राइस जो है वो भी मैं सेल कर रहा हूँ। ठीक है, और जो हस्क एंड ब्रांड है वो भी सेल कर रहा हूँ, राइट। अब जैसे यहाँ पे गिवन है ऑल आउटपुट्स वर सोल्ड इन द सेम वीक एट 35 पर केजी ऑफ राइस। ठीक है, दैट मीन्स पर किलोग्राम 35 रुपीज सेलिंग प्राइस है, तो पर टन इट वुड बी 35,000। ठीक है, बिकॉज 1 टन इज इक्वल टू 1,000 किलोग्राम्स, है ना, 1 टन इज इक्वल टू 1,000 किलोग्राम्स, तो 35 पर केजी प्राइस है, विच वुड बी 35,000 पर टन। ठीक है, तो मैं रेवेन्यू निकालूंगा, मेरा 35,000 पर टन का रेवेन्यू आ रहा है राइस से, और मेरे राइस कितना है 787.92 टन। ठीक है, इसके अलावा मेरा रेवेन्यू कैसे था, हस्किन ब्रांड से। ठीक है, हस्किन ब्रांड कितना था, 20 kg ऑफ पर एवरी 100 kg ऑफ दिस आउटपुट। ठीक है, मेरा आउटपुट वॉज 1176। ठीक है, 1176 जो मेरा आउटपुट था, उसका 20% वॉज हस्किन ब्रांड। ठीक है, तो दिस वुड बी इक्वल टू दिस वुड बी इक्वल टू 235.2 टन्स। ठीक है, अब ये मैं देख रहा हूँ दिस वॉज सोल्ड एट 1200 पर टन, तो मेरा क्या होएगा, दिस वुड बी 1200 पर टन में बेच रहा हूँ, कितना अमाउंट बेच रहा हूँ, विच इज इक्वल टू 235.2। ठीक है, दस मेरा टोटल रेवेन्यू अगर कैलकुलेट करोगे आप, तो दिस वुड कम अराउंड 278, लाइक 2 crore 78 lakh 59,440। ठीक है, एंड एट द सेम टाइम ये मेरा रेवेन्यू है, ये तीनों मिला के मेरी कॉस्ट हैं। ठीक है, तो मेरी कॉस्ट कितनी है, लगभग लगभग, इफ आई कैलकुलेट दीज ऑल दीज थ्री, दिस वुड बी 12 to the 24, 12 to 24, 264,000,000, ठीक है, which is 2 crore 64 lakhs, this would be 12 to the 36 and 3,60,000। ठीक है, एंड इसको अगर आप कैलकुलेट करोगे, दिस वुड बी रफली अराउंड व्हाट, आपको इसको 5 से मल्टीप्लाई करना है, यू डिवाइडेड बाय 2 एंड मल्टीप्लाइड बाय 10, तो इसको मैं 2 से डिवाइड करा तो कितना आएगा, 39,393.96। ठीक है, मल्टीप्लाइड बाय 10 या मल्टीप्लाइड बाय, मैं इसको 1000 कर देता हूँ। ठीक है, दिस वुड बी इज इक्वल टू 393,960। ठीक है, तो ये मेरी कॉस्ट आ गई। अब मैं दोनों को अगर माइनस करता हूँ, एडिंग ऑल दीज कॉस्ट्स एंड subtracting it from the total revenue, the answer that I will get is somewhere close to 7,05,480। ठीक है, the correct answer is closest to 7,05,000। ठीक है, moving to next question, the increase in rice output from week 1 to week 2। वीक 1 का मुझे राइस आउटपुट पता है विच इज 787.92। वीक 2 का मैं देखूंगा प्रोक्योरमेंट हायर हुआ है, प्रोक्योरमेंट हो गया 1500, मॉइस्चर डिडक्शन के बाद इट इज 1455 जिसका 68% राइस है। ठीक है, 1455 का 68% इज राइस इन वीक 2। ठीक है, वीक 1 में मैंने कितना देखा था, वीक 1 में इट वॉज 787.92 इन वीक 1। ठीक है, तो वीक 1 की तो डायरेक्ट वैल्यू है, वीक 2 की मैं डायरेक्ट वैल्यू निकालूंगा, दिस वुड बी समवेयर क्लोज टू अगर आप कैलकुलेट करोगे दिस वुड कम अराउंड 989.40। ठीक है, दोनों को मैं सब्ट्रैक्ट करूंगा, मेरे पास आएगा आंसर 201.5 टन। ठीक है, तो द आंसर वुड बी सी। ठीक है, नेक्स्ट क्वेश्चन आस्क्स इफेक्टिव रियलाइजेशन पर टन ऑफ पैडी। ठीक है, इन वीक 2 विच उन्होंने यहाँ एक्सप्लेनेशन भी दी है कि व्हाट इज द रियलाइजेशन वीक 2 का रेवेन्यू डिवाइड बाय टन्स प्रोक्योर्ड इन वीक 2। ठीक है, तो मुझे रेवेन्यू निकालना है वीक 2 का, दिस वुड बी, मैंने राइस निकाला 989.40। ठीक है, 989.40 वाज माय राइस। ठीक है, इसका मैंने देखा कि मेरा वीक 2 में कितने का मैं बेच पा रहा हूँ, वी सॉ ऑल आउटपुट्स वर सोल्ड, है ना, राइस एट इज अगेन सोल्ड एट 36 पर केजी है, विच मीन्स पर टन क्या कॉस्ट, क्या इसकी सेलिंग प्राइस होगी पर टन, इट वुड बी 36,000। दिस वुड बी 989.40 मल्टीप्लाइड बाय 36,000। ठीक है, अब मैं क्या क्या चीज सेल कर रहा था, मैं राइस भी सेल कर रहा था। ठीक है, और मैं हस्केन ब्रांड भी सेल कर रहा था। ठीक है, तो हस्केन ब्रांड की मैं देखता हूँ कितनी वैल्यू आएगी। हस्केन ब्रांड was how much, 19% of 1455, 1455 का 19%। ठीक है, और इससे मेरे को कितने पैसे मिल रहे हैं, व्हाट इज द सेलिंग प्राइस, कॉस्ट रिमेन अनचेंज्ड। ठीक है, मैं कितने पे बेच रहा था, 1200 पर टन पे, दिस मल्टीप्लाइड बाय 1200। ठीक है, दिस वुड बी समवेयर अराउंड 276.45, जिसको मैं मल्टीप्लाई करूंगा 1200 से। ठीक है, इफ यू कैलकुलेट, ठीक है, टोटल रेवेन्यू वुड कम अराउंड 3,59,50,140। ठीक है, टोटल प्रिक्योरमेंट कितना था, टन्स प्रिक्योर्ड इन वीक 2 वाज, दिस वाज 1500। ठीक है, तो सिंपली फॉर आंसर आई विल डिवाइड इट बाय 1500 and I will get the answer roughly around rupees 23,966.76। ठीक है, which is what closer to say 23,960 और 970। ठीक है, अगर मैं नॉर्मली देखूं, इट इज कैलकुलेट करूंगा, इट वुड बी क्लोजर टू 23,960, सो करेक्ट आंसर वुड बी बी। ठीक है, चलो मूविंग टू नेक्स्ट क्वेश्चन। कीपिंग वीक टू क्वांटिटी इज द सेम, द मिनिमम राइस सेलिंग प्राइस इन वीक 2 टू ब्रेक इवन लाइक नो प्रॉफिट एंड लॉस, है ना, तो बेसिकली मुझे क्या देखना है, प्राइस, राइस की मेरे को सेलिंग प्राइस नहीं पता। ठीक है, राइस की मुझे सेलिंग प्राइस नहीं पता, मुझे क्वांटिटी पता है कि मेरी 989.40 मेरी क्वांटिटी थी। ठीक है, जिसको मैं किसी एक्स प्राइस पे बेचूंगा, प्लस रेवेन्यू मेरा किससे और आता है, ठीक है, रेवेन्यू मेरा आता है हस्किन ब्रांड से ऑल्सो। ठीक है, जो मैं कितना बेच रहा था हस्किन ब्रांड 14, ये 989.40 है, हस्किन ब्रांड आई वाज सेलिंग हाउ मच, वी हैव कैलकुलेटेड दैट, ये हमने रेवेन्यू डायरेक्ट निकाला हुआ है इन वीक 2 राइट, 331,740। ठीक है, तो ये मेरा रेवेन्यू हुआ राइस से, 331,740 मेरा रेवेन्यू हुआ हस्किन ब्रांड से, ये है मेरा राइस से। ठीक है, ये है मेरा हस्किन ब्रांड से। ठीक है, और ये मेरे को ब्रेक इवन करना है, ब्रेक इवन मतलब मेरी ये जो टोटल रेवेन्यू है दिस शुड बी इक्वल टू माई कॉस्ट। कॉस्ट मेरी क्या थी, कॉस्ट मैंने निकाली थी, have we calculated the cost, cost in week 2, ये यहाँ पे है वी हैव कैलकुलेटेड राइट, कि मेरी कितनी कॉस्ट थी, तो दैट वाज समवेयर अराउंड, अगर आप कॉस्ट देखोगे दैट वुड बी समवेयर अराउंड crores 39 lakh 44,700. ठीक है, दिस इज पर टन कॉस्ट एंड पर टन रेवेन्यू. ठीक है, दिस मीन्स टोटल अगर आप देखोगे x की वैल्यू निकालना है इसमें, तो x की वैल्यू विल कम अराउंड 33,973 पर टन. तो मुझे पर केजी देखना है अगर, क्योंकि मेरा ऑप्शन पर केजी में है, तो शुड बी समवेयर अराउंड 33.973 पर केजी, राइट, विच इज रफली अराउंड 34 रुपीज पर केजी. ठीक है, आई होप ये समझ में आया होगा क्वेश्चन. एंड एट द सेम टाइम थोड़ा कैलकुलेशन हैवी है, तो इफ टाइम बचता है लुकिंग एट द क्वेश्चन, यू कैन ट्राई टू अटेम्प्ट इट एट लास्ट. ठीक है, कैलकुलेटर होगा अगर बाय चांस कैलकुलेटर अच्छा नहीं होता है इन द ऑफलाइन एग्जाम, है ना, कैलकुलेटर होता है अगर, तब इट वुड हैव बीन इजियर. बट द फैक्ट दैट क्लैट में कैलकुलेटर नहीं होता है, इट वुड बी अ बिट डिफिकल्ट, है ना. तो यू कैन कीप इट फॉर द लास्ट, है ना. लुकिंग एट द अदर वन, इन अप्रैल सिटी वाटर बोर्ड सप्लाइड 1200 मिलियन वाट लीटर्स ऑफ ट्रीटेड वाटर डिस्ट्रीब्यूटेड एज फॉलोज. ठीक है, ये अप्रैल मंथ का डेटा गिवन है कि 40 प्लस 25 65 70 एंड 30 टोटल 100% कैसे उसका यूज हुआ, है ना, कैसे डिस्ट्रीब्यूशन हुआ. मई में टोटल सप्लाई इंक्रीज बाय 10%, अप्रैल में 120 थी, तो ये मई में टोटल सप्लाई कितनी होगी 132. पॉलिसी चेंज, द इंडस्ट्रियल शेयर ड्रॉप बाय 5 परसेंटेज पॉइंट्स. ठीक है, अगर मैं बात करूं 2020 सॉरी बात करूं मई की, तो परसेंटेज पॉइंट्स डिक्रीज हो रहा है इंडस्ट्रियल विच इज 20 से 15%. एंड दिस 5 pp इज रीअलोकेटेड इक्वली टू रेसिडेंस एंड एग्रीकल्चर. तो यहाँ पे 2.5 यहाँ ऐड हो जाएगा. ठीक है, एग्रीकल्चर में 2.5 ऐड हो जाएगा, दिस वुड बी 12.5%. ठीक है, नॉन रेवेन्यू वाटर लॉसेज इन अप्रैल इज 8% ऑफ टोटल सप्लाई. ठीक है, टोटल सप्लाई मेरी यहाँ पे है 120. ठीक है, 120 का 8% वुड बी 12 8 आर 96, दैट वुड बी 9.6 लीटर्स. ठीक है, दिस वुड बी 9.6 liters. Residential tariff is given. ठीक है, तो we'll see that basis question. Commercial consumption in April was, commercial consumption we can see 25% of 120, that would be 25% multiplied by 120, which would be equal to 30. तो correct answer would be B. ठीक है, moving to next question, ratio of residential to industrial consumption in April. क्योंकि ये परसेंटेज शेयर सेम के रिस्पेक्ट में दिया है, परसेंटेज शेयर इज गिवन विद रिस्पेक्ट टू द सेम सप्लाइड और सेम सप्लाई ऑफ ट्रीटेड वाटर, वी कैन डायरेक्टली कंपेयर द परसेंटेजेस आल्सो. ठीक है, तो रेसिडेंशियल टू इंडस्ट्रियल पूछ रहे हैं, रेसिडेंशियल 40 है, इंडस्ट्रियल 20 है, दिस वुड बी 40 डिवाइड बाय 20, इट वुड बी इक्वल टू 2:1. करेक्ट आंसर इज सी. मूविंग टू नेक्स्ट क्वेश्चन, रेसिडेंशियल कंजम्पशन मे विल बी इक्वल टू. ठीक है, तो मई में मैं देखता हूँ, मई में मेरा टोटल सप्लाई थी 132, रेसिडेंशियल कंजम्पशन वाज 42.5%. ठीक है, दिस वुड बी 132 मल्टीप्लाइड बाय 42.5%. ठीक है, इसको इफ यू कैलकुलेट, ठीक है, अगर आप इसको कैलकुलेट करोगे तो दिस वुड कम अराउंड 56.1 million liters. Correct answer is option B. ठीक है, मूविंग टू नेक्स्ट क्वेश्चन, दिस बिल्ड रेवेन्यू फ्रॉम वाटर इन अप्रैल इक्वल्स टू. ठीक है, अब बिल्ड रेवेन्यू की बात आई है, दैट इज ₹12 पर 1000 लीटर्स. ठीक है, ₹12 पर 1000 लीटर्स. बट जो नॉन रेवेन्यू वाटर था उसकी लॉसेज वर 8%, है ना, दैट वाज 9.6 लीटर का तो लॉस हो गया जिससे कोई रेवेन्यू नहीं आया. ठीक है, तो रेवेन्यू वाला वाटर कितना हुआ 120 माइनस 9.6, दिस वुड बी इक्वल टू हाउ मच 110.4. ठीक है, तो बेसिकली दे आर नॉट आस्किंग फॉर रेवेन्यू, दे आर आस्किंग फॉर बिल्ड वाटर, है ना. नॉन रेवेन्यू वाटर 9.6 माइनस कर दिया, सो द करेक्ट आंसर वुड बी 110.4, विच इज ऑप्शन बी. ठीक है, 119 क्वेश्चन, इफ अ कंजर्वेशन ड्राइव कट्स रेसिडेंशियल अपरेल यूज बाय 5%, वॉल्यूम सेव्ड इज. ठीक है, तो अपन एक बार देख लेते हैं रेसिडेंशियल कितना था, 40%, 40% ऑफ 120, है ना, was 48. ठीक है, बट ये बोल रहे हैं कि 5% से इसका कम हो गया है. ठीक है, विच मीन्स कि जो मेरा 48 लीटर का मेरा रेसिडेंशियल शेयर था, ठीक है, इसका इससे इसको 5% से कम करना है, ठीक है। तो इसका 5% वुड बी 48 मल्टीप्लाइड बाय 5/100, ठीक है, विच वुड बी इक्वल टू हाउ मच, 2.4 मिलियन लीटर्स, ठीक है। मूविंग टू द लास्ट क्वेश्चन विच इज अप्रैल रेसिडेंशियल रेवेन्यू एट 12 पर 1000 लीटर, ठीक है, दिस इज ऑल्सो गिवन इन द क्वेश्चन, ठीक है, 12 पर 1000 लीटर, है ना। और मेरा रेसिडेंशियल रेवेन्यू पूछ रहे हैं, तो रेसिडेंशियल मेरा कितना सप्लाई था, रेसिडेंशियल सप्लाई वाज 120 मल्टीप्लाइड बाय 40%, विच वी सॉ, ठीक है, दिस वाज माय रेसिडेंशियल सप्लाई, जिसको मैं पर 1000 लीटर ₹12 में बेच रहा हूँ, ठीक है। तो ये मेरा फिगर जो गिवन था 120, दैट वाज 120 मिलियन लीटर्स, ठीक है। दिस मीन्स 120 मिलियन लीटर्स का 48% वुड बी, सॉरी, का 40% वुड बी हाउ मच, 48 मिलियन लीटर्स, राइट। अभी 48 मिलियन लीटर्स को, है ना, मैं बेच रहा हूँ, जस्ट अ मोमेंट, दिस शुड आइडियली बी 1000, है ना, दिस शुड बी नॉट पर 1000 लीटर्स, पर मिलियन लीटर्स, आई थिंक दैट्स सम क्लैरिटी रिक्वायर्ड है, बट अगर मैं निकालूंगा इसको, विच वुड बी 48 मल्टीप्लाइड बाय, this would be 48 multiplied by 1000 multiplied by 12. This will roughly come around how much, 48 into 2 96, which would be 500, 5,76,000 rupees, ठीक है। तो correct answer is 5,76,000. With this we are done solving the entire test, the entire mock, है ना। I hope you enjoyed solving this test, है ना। I hope all of you who have attempted must have scored somewhere around 90 to 100. If you have scored marks around 100, I think that's a good score. But if you are scoring below 80 or 85 in this mock, then you should prepare hard. You need to work very hard in the coming 45 to 50 days.